Chapter 381, Rescue. It went like this. First, a princess was injured under mysterious circumstances while the gods chose a new champion. In a departure from tradition, it was the king of a small but sovereign country, to the east of the new rising secular power. Then the princess was brought back by said king to his base of power, where she was ostensibly treated by his healers, but confined to quarters and not seen even by her own travel companions outside of those brought into seclusion with her. After that, the empress of the local power, as well as the queen that was the sister of the princess in question, sent messages to the king to demand the safe return of their sister/protégé and her companions. The king ignored their demands, and the princess was still not seen by anyone outside the castle. This is where it got tricky. Originally, there might, perhaps, have been news that the princess and her attendants had disappeared from the small kingdom, taken hostage, or rescued, who could say? This was, unfortunately, not the case. Instead, in place of quietly disappearing, a group of fighters had snuck into the castle and attacked the king's men. What was worse, they were clearly recognizable as associated with the empire. Although technically they might claim, if pressed, they were fighting for the kingdom of Cernlia, not the Central European Empire. In response to the kingdom's flagrant disregard of their demands and ultimatum, and to rescue the felled princess as well as to punish this grave injustice of kidnapping a royal guest who had come to build an alliance, the empire declared war on the kingdom of Prian. Forces started moving. There was, at this very moment, a dead swarm drone lying in a ditch just outside the city, carrying a briefcase with an official letter containing this declaration of war, shot by an arrow from a man of Prian. How unfortunate the king had not learned of its message before discovering the strike team. The empire had, thus, taken reasonable measures to inform its enemy of this state of war. Of course the king would learn of it soon enough in other ways. But the declaration was not just for him, it was for surrounding countries, too, for the international stage, which had been informed of this sequence of events most diligently. It was what Galatea had mostly focused on. Rescuing June was, of course, critical, but if they could avoid escalating the war to involve the Esimon and Western Confederation, they had to try. Or at least to position themselves well for it. The empire was preparing for war. More so than it had for a while, anyhow. Its ruler had decided that she would risk the proverbial wildfire of the war spreading beyond this conflict because getting June back was more important. King Stephen really should have just conceded and given in to their demands. Of course, he was hardly doing what was best for his country. Win or lose, the small kingdom would suffer. And frankly, it was very likely to lose against the empire. Even if the Esimon and the Western Confederation joined in, the other nations might stand against the empire, but it would be too late for Prian, which would be occupied by the empire in a matter of days. No, the king was acting on orders of his divine patron. Or most likely, to the benefit of the temple's power bases in the other two large nations. Probably both were true. It was probably fruitless to hope these two countries wouldn't use this as the excuse they had been waiting for to push the empire into war. But at least they could get the initiative, to some degree, and frame things as best they could. Declaring war on Prian was perfectly reasonable under the circumstances, and importantly, it was just that, on Prian. Not on Esimon or the Western Confederation. They were technically uninvolved. If they wanted to involve themselves, they had to start that war themselves. For now, there were still others to rally to the cause, Galatea supposed. That's quite the story, Leanne said. Seems like your royal family is living dangerously. They're not my royal family, but yes, it does seem like it, doesn't it? Hardly the most honorable target selection, Galatea replied. She wasn't entirely sure what to make of this psychic. Madress had provided her with an introduction, but now it fell to Galatea to convince her to join them, or if not, to at least give them some support. Galatea had thus far been unable to locate the other two psychics Madress knew in the area. She simply hadn't had enough time for a more intensive search, but Leanne probably knew their location and would hopefully at least help with that. True enough, the woman conceded. She looked like a reasonably successful peasant out to enjoy the nice day, dressed in simple but colorful clothing, her hair bound back, her skin tanned from the sun, and wearing little ornamentation. Her magic presence rather ruined the impression even if one didn't use the system, though. Leanne, level 65 psychic connector. No last name. She was probably really a farmer's daughter who'd risen high and refused every opportunity to take or make one for herself. Are you willing to help us do anything about it? Galatea asked, figuring it was best to come to the point. Leanne paused. She was clearly thinking hard, chewing on her lip a little. Galatea didn't say anything, aware that rushing her would only backfire. All right, she finally said. I will come with you. What, really? Galatea didn't move to show her surprise, but that was good news. Oh? Thank you. We would appreciate that. To be clear, Leanne added, I'm not saying I will fight for your empire. Especially not if this conflict moves beyond Prian. But I will come see what is going on and help you get your people out if necessary. That would be much appreciated, and I understand, Galatea said. Do you need time to prepare? Unfortunately, time is short. No, I can go right away. Is there anyone else you are taking? I assume you will teleport us, Lady Galatea? Galatea nodded. It was one reason she was doing this, even though someone who was a psychic themselves might have been better. But Madress was essential where she was. And few others could have moved so quickly. Sending Madress or even Isays, as a dark elf or elf priestess respectively, to effectively speak for the Empire would also carry other implications. Not so much for Galatea, even if she technically wasn't a subject of the Empire either, although one could argue that point, she supposed. She doubted many people knew or cared about that, though, being close with Regina made it almost immaterial in this context. It wasn't like she had other affiliations. I have not picked up anyone else, but I was originally hoping to recruit the two younger psychics that you pointed Madress to when the two of you last met. Perhaps we can make a detour? I doubt you have the time for that, Leanne said. I can guide you to them later, but if you want to make any difference, we should hurry. My long-distance sensors are not the best, but I can still tell there is something rather big going on in the capital from here. Well, that was faintly concerning. No one had contacted her yet, after confirmation that they were sending in troops, but she supposed they were busy with more immediate concerns. Like surviving the fight. Good point. If you're ready, then let's go. If you will? Galatea extended a hand. Leanne nodded sharply, then stepped forward. She didn't show any hesitation or uncertainty about this. Galatea used a little of her magic to try a bit of scrying first. Unfortunately, it was rather iffy, with the vision she got cutting out occasionally. Perhaps countermeasures were in place. That spoke against trying to get right into the thick of it, but she still wanted to get close. A moment later, they appeared on top of a wall of the castle. Leanne staggered a bit, half falling down to the walkway that wound its way around the inner wall to let defenders man it. Galatea followed her down, glancing around. There were too many men on the walls already. Their appearance had clearly surprised them, but they were starting to turn to face them, arrows nocked or weapons hefted. She waved a hand and formed a spell out of her mana, a bit of wind magic. A gust blew those too close to the two of them off the walkway, others were staggered or pushed down, which also meant they couldn't try to shoot her allies. The fight happening below was pure chaos, which might explain why some of these soldiers had hesitated to fire at anyone. Galatea was relieved they'd arrived in time, at least, despite a scene like this. Instead of fighting in two well-ordered ranks, the battle had clearly degenerated into a bit of a melee, with knots of fighters trying to stay together. Her own people were vastly outnumbered, and there were still new men streaming in or coming down from the walls to fight, but they held their own. Mars cleared a space around the civilians and their mages, protecting them, while the mages also attacked. Zephyr was clearly mostly on the defense, bringing up magical shields and occasionally swiping aside some groups of soldiers who'd caught his attention. Isays was employing similar tactics, but was more focused on the attack, and she'd clearly buffed the melee fighters they had. Some of the servants had taken up weapons from fallen soldiers and were trying their best, with varying degrees of skill. June was in the middle of their group and not visibly casting, but clearly using her psychic abilities. The one most notable for that was Madress, though. She walked through the chaos almost untouched. Entire groups of Prian men-at-arms would suddenly switch sides, stabbing others in the back. Sometimes it was just a single man attacking his comrades. There was little pattern in these events, making them hard to anticipate. The only one who was clearly unaffected was the king, who tried to maintain order in his ranks. Galatea might not have a class connected to the gods, but she saw mana differently than humans did. She was made of it, after all, so his identity was easily apparent. Others were not as lucky. She saw more than one man sinking to the ground, weeping, staring at his hands or trying to shake another, unmoving body. Hardly able to believe what their own hands had been made to do. Galatea couldn't help but feel for them a little. It wasn't these men's fault that their king had made this decision. They would suffer for that decision, and in the course of Regina now attacking them for June's sake, when they might have hoped to ally with the Empire. Of course, it would not be entirely fair to blame Regina, either. She had little political choice but to try to get June back, even if she wouldn't do it for personal reasons. But Galatea pushed these considerations from her mind and instead floated down as she joined the battle properly, using her magic in area effect attacks. She'd spent a lot of mana on teleporting, so she had to be cautious. Galatea started walking through the battlefield. She was incorporeal. Any soldier who tried to attack her with physical weapons found himself stumped, and usually brought down quickly. It was fortunate that the kingdom had relatively few mages. Although the Order of the Sun Temple did, they were clearly the more dangerous opponents, the backbone of resistance here. If Madress wasn't messing with them, probably using psychic illusions mainly, from what Galatea could guess, this would be a lot worse. Someone pressed lightly on her mental defenses. Galatea almost tried to harden her mind against the intrusion, but then recognized the vague feeling attached to it and instead focused on who was reaching out. "Good to see you here," Madress said. She wasn't looking at her, but making her way to June. "And you brought Leanne, too?" "Yes. I'm not sure if she's willing to fight, though. Only as long as we're not doing anything worse," she said. Madress was clearly unhappy with the situation. "If she was willing to help me go all out, we could probably take control here. But maybe it's better if we don't try." Were there other psychics? 2, including Helen. They should both be knocked out. I had to leave Helen behind when I went to help here. Galatea turned her magical senses to the rest of the castle, looking for a familiar signature. Looks like some other people have secured her. Madress' touch on her mind waned as she clearly checked on that situation. Well, damn it. I don't have time to go and get her from those men again. At least they won't be able to wake her. Before Galatea could suggest that they send someone else to take the apparently unconscious woman, the king's men had rallied a bit and surged forward. They were clearly heading for June. "Not on my watch." She focused and, taking a page from Regina's book, conjured some nitroglycerin, shooting it at the enemy fighters. She would have gone with acid or something nastier, but the risk of it splashing on her allies was too great. She had gotten these trajectories correct, though, and a series of explosions shook the courtyard. It broke the Order's charge, although they had enough magical barriers that not many men were actually hurt. Zephyr took advantage and followed it up with a few wind spells and fireballs. As an encore, Galatea conjured some thermite. It depleted her mana pool dangerously, even as she drew in mana from her surroundings, but the effect was worth it. She also used the chance to finally go to join June, who was watching everything around her and clearly anxious. She still looked pale and even swayed a bit. Galatea would have braced her, but didn't want to give herself extra mass right now. "Are you okay?" The girl started a bit as she turned to her. "Fine. Better than some of my people." Galatea ignored the bitter undertone. "We'll heal them," she said reassuringly. She'd point out that they wouldn't have been any safer in their enemy's power later. "Do you have a plan?" "We can't just keep fighting, unless you want to push them to retreat." June made a weird head motion, half shaking it and half nodding, her eyes still darting around. At the same moment, a section of the Order fighters that had formed a shield wall to advance on them turned and suddenly charged the other group around the king. Leanne had somehow come to sit on the walkway not far away and above them, and smiled. It looked like she was working well with Madress, then. We just need to encourage them to take off the pressure and regroup, if not retreat completely, June said. We don't need to leave, we just need to hold on a little longer. Ah, it's like that then. Galatea nodded, turning again to look for her next target. King Stephen had somehow made it out of this fight, too. Galatea was seriously starting to wonder if whatever blessing his god had given him included luck manipulation or direct divine protection, considering he was clearly the target of most of these strikes. He suddenly lit up with a slight glow, and the fighting in a few meters radius around him ceased completely. The combat paused for a moment as everyone looked in his direction. The king had grabbed a spear from somewhere and threw it at them. Edmund pushed June out of the way. Stupid, it wouldn't have quite hit her, a part of Galatea analyzed, and staggered as it instead hit his side. She took a step forward, sending a fireball at the king. An order mage caught it on a barrier. Gather yourselves, men of Prian, the king shouted, waving his arm. Regroup. Fall back to the gates and inner halls. Follow me. June sighed. Well, there's that, she muttered. Galatea sent a few more spells after them just on principle, as did Zephyr and Ices, but they largely let the enemy withdraw unopposed. They didn't exactly have the numbers for a chase, she supposed, too large a risk of being encircled and cut down in some prepared ground by the enemy. Madress appeared beside them. She also looked a bit paler than usual, something Galatea hadn't even known was possible, and somehow drawn. They're taking Helen and leaving the castle, and probably the city, entirely, she said. June shook her head. Maybe when reinforcements get here, we can try and chase her down. For now it would be stupid to split up. Madress nodded. Just glad you're all right. Galatea glanced at Edmund. Jem and Zephyr were administering first aid, she'd join them and do what she could in a bit. Taking a second, she looked up into the sky. A loose cloud of dark spots, bigger than a swarm of birds, was approaching rapidly. Maybe they could try to chase down the king once the reinforcements arrived, too. Chapter 382, Escape. Tim had had to beg, plead, use sweet reason and threaten to fly off on his own before his mother agreed to let him lead this strike force. Not that he would have actually done that if Regina had ordered him not to, but it showed his commitment. With several of her children once again taken captive by their enemies and 2 of her students in danger, she was reluctant to risk any of the people she was close to, he supposed. They really had bad luck regarding envoys to countries that should not have been hostile. Regardless, like Jem and Ace, Tim had valuable skills for this situation. It probably helped that most of their sapient drones had now been recalled by Regina's Queen's summons ability, leaving only Zoe and Jay, who had come to lead her Starguard escort. They'd only started these rescues once it became clear the group really were prisoners, to not inflame the situation. Previously, and since Regina hadn't used the ability much, the cooldown hadn't improved that much from the original 1-day limit, but it was something. Tim had been watching through the psychic link, as closely as he could without distracting anyone else, and had driven his group of flying and mounted fighters relentlessly. Once the fighting had started in earnest and Madress and Galatea along with that new psychic showed up, he'd even used his skill to boost their stats, giving his troops a short pre-battle speech to psych them up. Now he held on tightly as they descended toward the castle. He closed his eyes against the wind and focused on his sense of the drones with him, directing them to various positions. The wings of their formation swept out, covering the castle and its surroundings. A few mages and shooters, flyers with ranged weapons, and other drones with the capability opened fire on the soldiers. Other drones dropped their payloads. Because of the need for speed, they didn't carry any big and heavy bombs, but what they did have was more than enough to collapse a few of the less sturdy buildings too close to the inner walls and to shake the ground. The gate was targeted by a few of his subordinates and almost completely destroyed. Now it didn't matter that their enemies had managed to keep a few men on the walls, the Hive had the advantage of a higher position. Personally, Tim had hoped he'd get to drop a copy of the declaration of war on the king's head. Unfortunately, the man was already holed up deeper inside the central castle building. Oh well. It's good to see you, Jem greeted him as Tim's mount descended. Tim smiled. Instead of pulling into a dive to the ground right away, he urged the swarm drone into a tight circle around the inner castle. Thor had volunteered to come, as had every other sapient flying drone mount, but Regina had decided to limit the number of sapient drones involved, so they were all riding swarm drones instead. "Looks like you had it under control," Tim replied. "How is everyone?" "The wounded? Hopefully, they'll all make it," Jem said. "It's a good thing you brought Tor, though. We can use a real healer." "I think Edmund might be worst off. They've been trying to stabilize him." It looked like Tor had already sat down and dismounted and was now checking on Edmund. Tim was relieved that it didn't look like they'd suffered high casualties. He checked in on the others, quickly taking stock. Quite a few wounded that would have to be seen to. It was clear that Zephyr and others had prioritized defense, and prioritized saving people's lives instead of avoiding all injuries. It did seem that 2 of the servants had died, though. June would be upset. Judging by their positions and the weapons clutched in their hands, they'd tried to fight but lacked the training or classes to go toe-to-toe with the Prian men-at-arms. The situation was under control now, though, so Tim turned his focus on the enemy. His charges should be safe for now, but they couldn't rule out an attempt to counterattack, and they still needed to smoke out and take care of the remaining soldiers. Completely taking control of the city would have to wait. His was only the first wave of reinforcements. There were more flying drones coming, and, of course, the ground troops. They could secure the city and the other towns in this kingdom. The plan called for fast strikes to overwhelm the defenders and deny them any time to dig in and build up their defenses. With an eye to securing the territory against a potential similar attack from Esimon, of course. Tim didn't think the Esimon had the capability to do something like that, or to beat them there, at least not without letting the Empire secure the area for a few days first. If they even decided to fight this out at all. But he was not planning to underestimate their enemies either. They'd already slid into this little war with relatively minimal planning, considering how quickly events had overtaken their previous plans. Several of his soldiers had dismounted and joined the group on the ground or fanned out a little to act as perimeter guards, while others prepared to take the rest of the castle. They weren't as many drones as still remained in the air, since the main part of their forces were flying drones, or otherwise more capable in the air. Tim joined those on the ground and strode forward. He wanted to talk with June in more depth, but that could come later. Zoe joined him, and he bumped her shoulder with his, briefly intertwining his blade arm with hers. "You're doing okay?" he asked her. "As well as I can. I've had enough of stuff like this, Tim. At least this time we don't have to actually escape but can take the fight to them right here." He didn't point out that she had actually been captured this time. Some people had the worst luck, he supposed. At least Zoe wasn't injured. Once they got to it, the fall of the castle was almost anticlimactic. The Imperial forces advanced, swarm drones taking point to provide a screen, the rest of the soldiers and sapient drones remaining behind them. Madress stayed with June and Edmund, but Isaes and Zephyr joined them, and they used their magic to good effect. Not that they encountered much of a challenge. Tim focused on one of his early and more powerful abilities, Queen's Charge. He didn't know if being a royal kind of champion had any connection at all to being a god's champion, but it couldn't hurt. If they encountered the king, he would do his best. Until then, he relied on his sword and blade arms against the soldiers he encountered. Many of them were clearly shaken, whether by the bombardment or the Empire's sudden attack as a whole, he didn't know. Wonder if they expected their god to protect them from it, he thought a bit spitefully. He fought his way forward, leading his soldiers and occasionally trying to catch up with the higher-level individuals pressing ahead, until they reached the central part of the keep. It had clearly been expanded into a vaster palace, but there were still remnants of the old keep, and the narrower corridors and small doors made good choke points for the defenders to use. It would have been easier if there had been more of those, though, even if they weren't up against a few pissed-off high-level fighters along with Tim's group. Zoe at least clearly took the opportunity to work out some anger. Eventually, they met in a larger hall that seemed rather disused now, although it might have had a different purpose once. Tim looked around. They had taken a few captives and killed even more enemy soldiers, but the numbers could have been higher. And that was all, they'd found nothing else. "Looks like they bailed," Zoe said. Tim nodded, focusing on the psychic link to coordinate with the flying drones and those he'd left outside. There have been a few Order fighters here, but I imagine most of them are trying to flee with the king, Zephyr added. Is it possible there's an escape tunnel or something of the sort? Tim paused. He'd confirmed that no one had seen the king or the bulk of the Order men exiting the building, so he'd first assumed they were holed up somewhere. But that was certainly possible. Tentatively, he reached out to those left in the courtyard for now, and after checking on them, called June. Hey, how are things here? Fine. They've stabilized Edmund. What's happening? He shared an impression of the situation and relayed Zephyr's theory. Can you check if their minds are moving? And ask Madress? Give me a moment. He waited while June did her thing. She'd seemed exhausted, unsurprisingly, so he didn't have high hopes of her detecting whatever was happening, but hopefully Madress had a little more energy left. The Dark Elf contacted him directly. They must be hiding themselves somehow. It's hard to get a direct bearing or even confirm the number of minds in their group. Maybe they met up with Helen and woke her up, or one of the Sun Temple has a useful skill. But they have definitely moved. I assume they're using underground tunnels. Try to find one, would you? We will, but they will be long gone. I know, but seeing a tunnel entrance might still give us some hints. For instance, seeing whether their tunnels are connected to the Dark Elf's network. I doubt it, but maybe they have breached it and are using these tunnels now. Tim frowned. That would be, well, complicated. I'll look. Can you talk to the Dark Elves? I was going to, yes. They have not sent many men to our aid, given this situation, but they'll be very interested to know if the tunnels are compromised, if nothing else. She withdrew, clearly going to talk to other people, and Tim turned to those with him. He caught them up quickly on the situation and then led the search for the hidden escape their enemies must have used. Fortunately, a few of them had skills that helped in searching for hidden spaces, so it didn't take too long to find what they were looking for. He had to admit they'd hidden it cleverly. There was a false back in a supply closet in a small storage room in the back of the keep, on ground level, and opening it led to a small hidden vault that held a few scattered coins, but was mostly empty. You had to realize there was another space below it, or rather a small shaft through which someone could jump down. If the wooden paneling hadn't been slightly scratched, they might have taken longer to notice. It still took a bit of searching to find the hidden switch in the other room. Quite clever, honestly. Tim descended after Mars, looking around. The tunnel was short and cramped, clearly different from the Dark Elf's work or the others he'd seen. It led straight to the closest wall of the castle and beyond. As they explored the tunnel, it sloped downward, clearly going under the wall, and then curved a little. Then they had to wait for a bit for others to catch up. Madress contacted him again and informed him she was taking another group around on the surface. Luckily, they'd started the process of getting control of the city, easier now that the castle had definitely fallen, so they shouldn't have any problems there. Tim knew he should oversee that effort, but Madress agreed that at the moment, this was more important. The others are almost here, he informed her as well. Owen can take over in the city, then. I think he might do better at it than the other officers, anyway. I've sensed them, she agreed. There's no major resistance in the city, yet. Most likely, any capable soldiers or Order members who were there have also tried to flee. I'll help your people hunt them down later. For now, onwards? Of course, he agreed. Following the tunnel, it quickly became clear that it did intersect with the Dark Elf's network, something he'd suspected. For one thing, it was leading east-northeast. And the tunnel dropped suddenly and intersected a different one. And it was evident that it was built differently. It looked like they'd deliberately breached one of the Dark Elf's tunnels. And judging by the scratch mark and a quick analysis from Jem, it was probably recently. The king's men might have even dug the tunnel up to this point and only connected it to the network later. They continued for a while, leaving the city behind. Tim glanced back at the others. Those who had fought heavily were clearly starting to flag a little. It might not be physical tiredness, but having used up most of their mana would also take a toll. You're going to encounter other people soon, Madress warned him. Dark elves, that is, unfortunately not our quarry. It seems they've come out in a bit of force. Perhaps they'll help you track them down. She didn't say it, but he got the impression it might already be a bit late for that. No sign of our enemy having reached the surface? I'm quite sure this tunnel continues until almost the border to Esimon, if not further, she said. So perhaps, but it's not guaranteed that they will. We can't use flying drones underground. If it came to a fight, it would also be tricky. Tim slowed down and squinted into the darkness. As promised, it didn't take long. Their current tunnel curved and opened into a slightly wider lane. It allowed him to get a good look at the incoming group of dark elves, clearly soldiers, marching several abreast. Since most of his people were still in the castle and city, that meant there were more of them present. Halt, one of the dark elves called. Identify yourselves. Tim suppressed a sigh and stepped forward. Prince Tim of House Woolton, he said crisply. My associate, Madress Yulaven, talked with your superiors. You should know why we're here in Prian. We're currently chasing our enemies, who dug their own tunnels and breached yours. There was some whispering, then the leader stepped forward and bowed. Your Highness. Mistress Yulaven is not with you? She's not far, he said. Her group is tracking them above ground. I'm sure she's listening in on this conversation. He nodded a bit jerkily. I see. I do not believe it is clear she actually has the legal authority to allow others to use our passages, however. Tim frowned. We're allies, even if temporarily. Surely you won't get lost in details like that? I doubt every allied soldier of the Eternal Dark has to specifically request permission for setting foot in your tunnels, do they? The man was silent for a moment, his eyes flicking to his men. I am sure. Well, we won't stop you. Good luck in your hunt. You're not going to help? The dark elf hesitated for a moment. We have gathered information as well, Prince Tim. This petty king is aided by the Order of the Sun Temple, which is a powerful force from Esimon and the Western Confederation. If we fight them, it could potentially be taken as an act of war. Even if the nations would not, starting hostilities with an order like this without the approval or knowledge of my government is not a decision I can make. I apologize, but it's not a risk we can take. Tim almost sighed again. Great. He could tell it would be a waste of time trying to change his mind. Not that he couldn't understand his position, to a point. And any time he spent trying to change it would be time lost if they wanted to catch Stephen and his men. We'll switch, I'll talk to these men and you can keep pursuing them, Madress offered. That's still lost time. Until you get here, even if they agree, by that point it might not matter. We'll send some flying drones north, June chimed in. She must have been quietly watching. Until then, we'll have to be content with having won the city. There was that, he supposed. Chapter 383, Mobilization. Regina had cancelled most of her meetings for the day. Of course, that just meant there were new ones that had sprung up, owing to the present situation. But she had given herself a lot of quiet time, and made extra sure she would not be disturbed when Madress and her group actually infiltrated Prian. Now that things had settled somewhat, for the moment, she ceased focusing on her psychic senses and instead turned her full attention to the world around her. This time, she wasn't sitting quietly on her bed in her bedroom or anything. Instead, she was in a conference room with several of her closest advisors and some officers who weren't currently needed elsewhere. As well as the few drones she'd summoned from Prian. They didn't strictly need to be here, but she liked keeping them where she could see them right now. For now, she stretched a bit, ignoring people's looks, before she updated them on the situation again. Several other drones in the room were also doing that, as they talked over the psychic link to drones in Prian, of course. We've heard from the ambassador, Your Imperial Majesty. One of the aides that went in and out of the room had passed a message to Dane, and he looked up now. Elikand is grateful for our alliance and more than happy to grant our soldiers safe passage across their lands. They've stated they are willing to help. In fact, they would welcome deployments of Imperial soldiers to assure everyone's safety. And the prince has expressed willingness to travel to Sarah to assure you of his intentions in person. Regina smiled. Prian didn't directly border Esimon, although it didn't make much of a difference. The strip of land separating them wasn't too large. But the country it belonged to, Elikand, was clearly not making the same decision Prian had. It sounded like they were trying to assure their safety instead. The ruler was probably not just coming because he wanted to talk to her. That Sarah was far from the fighting was a happy coincidence, she was sure. It seemed they were trying to get in good with the Empire, though. They would probably also try to talk to the Esimon. Not that she was necessarily opposed to someone playing intermediary and possibly helping to calm the situation. Extend my compliments to the ambassador. She turned to her own aides. Come up with an appropriate gift for me, please? Of course, my queen, Tio nodded. He was one of Ira's ments and had quickly proved he was good at organizing things. Few people cared that he was technically a shooter. And we should schedule an audience with him for later, she added. There was a lot of diplomacy to be conducted, she couldn't leave all of it to her subordinates. I suggest hosting a state dinner for the envoys and important visitors from the eastern countries, Ira spoke up. It might be good to get a sense of them as a group instead of only dealing with them individually, and giving them attention will be appreciated. Regina nodded. See to it. We can make time tomorrow, I'm sure. There was a short silence as several other people also made some mental reconfigurations to take account of these developments. Regina was grimly certain she would not have time for much else today or the following days, and she'd be lucky if she got enough time to sleep. Still, she couldn't be too annoyed. She was just relieved that they had finally rescued June and Edmund and her drones. Well, for a given value of rescued, of course, they were still there and they might still have to fight again. What's our overall progress? She asked. Give me a brief status update. She could have just looked in the psychic link, and had done that before, but getting a summary and their take on it would still be worthwhile. The castle in Prian's capital has been fully secured and is under our control, Ben reported. Unfortunately, our garrison strength, so to speak, is still low. It would be hard to hold it against a dedicated assault. We simply have too much need of soldiers everywhere. The city is not what I would call entirely secured yet, although we do have overall control. There is no resistance of note at the moment. We will need to deal with the local institutions. There are quite a few local nobles, trade guilds, and the like that have private guards. They seem to have accepted our occupation for now, but we do need to set up a proper administrative structure, even a temporary one. We're working on it, Regina replied. Please go on. Our mobilization is progressing as planned, he reported with a hint of pride. We will be able to move the full corps we have planned and simultaneously move the corresponding troops up to guard the border by the next few days. It will drastically cut into our available pool of flying drones, so we are moving troops by road in several steps and iteratively where possible. The division sent to reinforce the Northeast report only minor delays. The Gnomes report they have fully called up their eastern forces and will move into position to support us. Madress and Tim have been leading 2 groups out to chase after King Stephen and the Order of the Sun Temple men. They've met up with a strike force of dark elves. Unfortunately, as they had to secure the castle and find the tunnel first, the enemy has got a notable head start. They're getting very close to the border with Esimon. Regina nodded. She could faintly sense the mood in the room shift. She had already moved a few drone breeders into positions closer to the border, or at least to their key logistics nodes set up to support operations in the region, and had them making more flying drones. It was always going to happen. They might have had to reorient a little, but the Imperial military had made a lot of plans and they were prepared. Ben's progress showed that. She'd still hoped to avoid an actual military confrontation, had hoped to simply get June and the others out quietly, but it was clear that attempt had failed. Maybe it had never been a realistic option. Not if her enemies sent their best order fighters and Helen to bring them to territory that was firmly under the gods' influence. Regardless, now that they were on this path, they would wage this war properly, show their strength, hopefully minimize disruption to the civilian life of the small kingdom, and make sure they were prepared for the larger conflict to come. Regina was more concerned about King Stephen and his supporters apparently escaping. It didn't sound like her people still had much hope of catching them. She could feel the gazes of several people in the room on her. There was a bit of tension in the air, and she knew they wondered how it would go. Would she risk pressing into Esimon if their quarry crossed the border? There was still no official alliance between Esimon and the Western Confederation. But at this point, everyone probably figured they had a secret alliance. That shouldn't be much of a thing here, but they weren't limited to the medieval playbook. There was probably a treaty with some secret agreements in place. Getting into a war with one nation would mean a war with both. For now, Regina refused them an answer and instead focused on the details she could affect, mostly regarding their military movements and how to handle the territory they were now occupying in Prian. Over the psychic link, she set large groups of drones in motion. Swarm drones especially still sometimes reacted better if a command came from her, unless the Hive member giving the order was actually present. It was hardly a large concern, but she figured she might as well do it. A few minutes later, someone else she had asked for in the course of her efforts to address the situation was shown in. Now that the gnomes were joining the Empire, Marianne Nerald had little to do, and she'd been recalled to the capital for now. Last Regina heard, she'd been a bit restless. This should do fine. Regina glanced around, but she figured she didn't have secret orders that the people present here shouldn't hear, so she simply waved the lady over. My Empress. The older lady knelt before her. You may rise, Regina said, wondering at that. Everyone had seemed a bit more formal today. She'd never punished anyone for not showing enough reverence to her, unless they were actually acting disrespectfully. It meant this sort of thing was mostly up to the people to decide what they considered appropriate. She knew it would be stupid to stop them from these obeisances, of course, trying that would undermine her position. Not that she really wanted to, it was a useful social signal. My congratulations on the victory against Prian and the rescue of Princess June and her companions, Nerald said, also inclining her head at Kiera, who was looking over from where she sat on the other side of the room at another small table. How may I serve you? Thank you, Regina responded, not particularly surprised she was aware of that. The rumor was probably starting to spread and Marianne was well informed. I have another task for you, now that you have served the Empire so admirably with the gnomes, Lady Marianne. I would make you military governor of the area of Prian we have under occupation. The woman hid her surprise well, at least outwardly. I am honored, Your Imperial Majesty. I will do my best to meet your expectations. Of course. I have the highest confidence in you. Although I will be available to help if there are any issues, of course. I will be keeping a close eye on the area for now. Regina didn't say that she was the obvious pick. Marianne had experience with the Esimon and the gnomes, and had at least started to make contacts with the dark elves in Ignis Alarin's embassy. Being a human would make some things easier with the locals, but she'd also shake things up a little. May I ask what this role will entail? I am not an officer of the military. You will need to coordinate closely with the Imperial military in the area, of course. Particularly with their commanding officers, and perhaps the general staff. You will also be working with an elected council we are preparing to set up. The idea is that, if we remain in possession of the territory, this council will gradually be given the power of government. For now, you will be the highest authority directing administration of the region. The army will assist, including enforcing martial law, curfews where appropriate and the like. She inclined her head. I see. I will strive to discharge my duties well, my Empress. I assume I am also to act as a diplomatic representative for the Empire? Yes, exactly, Regina nodded, pleased that she understood. The Imperial official in charge there would be a natural diplomatic point of contact. There would be drones present to link them into the psychic network, of course, so any important messages or proposals would still reach her quickly. For now, please take a seat, she added, waving her into a chair. We must discuss the military situation. And that they did, for the next hour or so. There was a lot to be considered. Regina knew Ben and some of his most senior officers were treating this a little like a warm-up exercise, or a test for their coming war. Personally, she was also interested in their weak points. She could already see it was an issue that the rail lines weren't completed yet. There were some, of course, but hardly the network spanning the whole of the empire that she wanted. It would have simplified their troop movements a lot, and also their logistics. As it was, the soldiers still had to move into Prian on foot, mounted, or with limited flying drones, though at least the reinforcements could be moved up more quickly using the finished rail connections in eastern Cernlia. It meant the forces gathered around Sarah would be lightened, still, but that was fine. Transport of food and other equipment, especially ammunition, also had to be organized. And of course, Regina had to make sure that all of these plans didn't expose the existence and importance of the new excavation site and ruins they'd found. Ben had positioned some units nearby, close enough to defend the site, under the justification of a defensive node to protect the eastern part of Cernlia. Finally, after they'd hashed out more of the plan, settled details, and discussed some updates, Regina felt Tim contacting her again. She held up a hand and leaned back, closing her eyes as a signal that she was focused on the psychic link. "I'm sorry, my queen," he apologized to start with. "We're coming up on the border. I've had flying drones watching the area all along, but they haven't gone back up above ground. Our new allies admitted there were tunnels going right up to the border territories. I assume they followed one to the end. And it's possible that the Esimon have actually expanded them from their side." She could sense Tim's group, still in some tunnels meters under the ground. Dark elf scouts had shown them the way, but the passage was cramped, requiring them to go single file, and their progress had been slowed. Madress was still a bit further away, detouring to avoid some features of the terrain. There were several crossings of the tunnels behind them, and maybe more ahead. Regina pinched the bridge of her nose. "When this is over, ask Madress to talk to them about collapsing their tunnels. We can't afford to give our enemies a road leading straight to our territory to attack us with. For now." She paused, thinking. There was at least one psychic with the fleeing king and order fighters, probably two, since unfortunately they'd taken the other one in their retreat as well as Helen. They were probably in contact with people in Esimon. It might also help to explain how they'd navigated the tunnels so easily. Unless it was straight up a divine gift of information. Something still didn't add up, and she made a note to look into it. It seemed unlikely that they'd managed to map out all these tunnels without alerting the Dark Elves. She'd ask Madress later, but the Dark Elves had known people were in the tunnels and sent their own strike force. They probably had sentries, magical alarms, or something. The more likely explanation was a traitor among the Dark Elves who'd given info to the Esimon, King Stephen, or the Order of the Sun Temple. Regardless, for now, it meant Esimon would be prepared. They were probably already mustering forces at their border. The flying drones had picked up increased activity and had also seen movements of people further away. They were focused on the border area and the land leading up to it for now, so they hadn't seen any details of what was going on further inland, but still. "You need to turn back," Regina concluded, unhappily. "I might risk the diplomatic escalation, but if they have soldiers waiting for you, you risk being ambushed with superior forces." "I understand," Tim replied. She could see he was also frustrated, but he understood her reasoning. "Should I also ask our guides about the information?" He'd clearly picked up on her thought. Regina shook her head. "Ask Madress instead, discreetly. I'm not sure who we can trust. Although, I'll ask her if she can go after our enemies discreetly. We can at least watch where they go and what they do. We'll send a few flying drones as well." She withdrew from Tim and turned her focus to other people, informing several other drones, before she sent a few orders to the flying drones with their advance force. This was already stretching her range pretty thin. If they went much farther, she wouldn't be able to see much. But even swarm drones, especially higher-level ones, were smart enough to follow orders to go somewhere, observe, and then return. And she had a few keepers who were good at getting information from their minds and putting it in the psychic link. Regina watched as several of them split from their flocks and ascended. They would be flying very high, hopefully escaping detection from the Esimon, or at least not being shot down as easily. Then she searched for her mentor's mind, to ask another favor. She was tempted to request that Madress attempt to kidnap Helen or King Stephen. She'd shown she could do things like that before, after all, but she'd restrain herself. The risk was high, especially since they still didn't know what sort of abilities or protection the champion had. But at least Madress could watch. Pretty soon, Regina might send soldiers marching this way. Well, for now, she certainly needed to ensure the tunnels were guarded. Chapter 384, Crossing. Madress had never really traveled into Esimon before. She couldn't deny that a part of her was excited to do it now. Of course, she would probably not see much of the country, the way she would do while traveling normally. The country itself would be too consumed by preparations for war. It could still be very interesting. Dangerous, of course, especially because she was already tired and had used up most of her mana. She would have to sleep soon. Presumably, the quarry she was chasing would do the same, though. Even if they used flying beasts for part of their journey, they wouldn't be crossing the country inside a single day. It was already night, anyway. You should not forget that Lucas Clausen is in the eternal dark, she told Regina, thinking about the wider implications of leaving right now. Trust me, I haven't forgotten. So you think he is involved in our enemies learning maps of the tunnel systems? I don't see why he wouldn't be. It's an important gain for them, which would not be too difficult for him to get. At least he'd be well positioned for it. The plans are supposed to be secret, in that not just anyone can access them, but they are not that secret. Hardly impossible in exchange for a few favors or straight-up bribes. And he's probably developed contacts in the western regions, those closer to his home. Contacts who might now be active, or perhaps sending information back to him, her student realized. Madress sent her a mental nod. Be careful with your information, that's all I'm saying. I won't be there right now, but I'm sure you can develop closer relationships with the local Eternal Dark officials on your own. You're not supposed to be gone too long, Regina replied, a bit of concern in her words. I won't be. You should simply strike while the iron is hot. Now, if you'd give some orders to the flying drones? Already done. Do you need anything else before you set out? You're sure you don't want someone to accompany you? They'd only hinder me. It's easier to only hide my own presence. And I want June back within Imperial borders as much as you do, I think. Edmund should return, too. Yes, they'd both gone above and beyond. Madress paused for a moment. There was something in Regina's mental voice. Maybe it was like that. She was starting to have a certain suspicion, but made sure to keep it from the surface of her mind right now and didn't ask about it. She'd wait to see how it turned out without trying to meddle, or suggesting it. That was Regina's business and not something Madress wanted to poke her own head into. Instead, she turned her focus on her surroundings to finish her preparations, and then to several people further away. Primarily those remaining in Prian. She should at least check in with June and the others, after leaving them behind to chase their enemies. There hadn't been much time to actually talk with either of the younger psychics, unfortunately. Please do be careful, June said earnestly when she contacted them. I'd hate to switch places. You wouldn't make as good a prisoner as a young princess like me. You brat, Madress replied, but she didn't bother to hide the fondness in her mental voice. You keep forgetting that Madress is high nobility in her home, Edmund said, hesitantly getting into the spirit of the teasing. Isn't it true that she could also be called a princess? Madress smiled to herself, deciding to be amused rather than disdainful at being saddled with that title. Maybe if House Yulaven held any real territory, she replied. And if the Eternal Dark was a little less unified. Despite appearances, we're not actually a collection of principalities. The feeling of June's mind turned contemplative for a second, but then their pretty little princess clearly made herself move on from the subject. She turned more serious. We have not had any diplomatic response from Esimon or the Westerns yet, correct? At least we are not at war, but it also doesn't give much insight into what they are doing. Do not worry about me, June, Madress replied. If I am gone for much longer, you will need to take over for me at the excavation. We do need to get the monster activity under control, at the very least. I won't let you down, June promised. I know you won't. I will see you later. If she lingered much longer, she would hardly get to leave at all, so Madress started moving. Of course, there was still one last thing to see to. Since their two groups had met up, she didn't have to go far to find Zephyr. The man was standing above ground, watching the sky. She wondered if he was sensing the extent of the tunnels beneath their feet, although they were not standing right above one. I hope you still have enough mana, she said. Neither of them needed to clarify for what, they'd both been informed of all details. She did like the efficiency of the Empire's operations. Zephyr smiled weakly, showing that he was probably cutting it close. "I can cast a good haste in my sleep," he replied. "Better you than me out there, Lady Madress." Madress only shrugged. She decided against needling him about that time she had snuck into his army's war camp and kidnapped him. They were probably both thinking about it anyway. Without further ado, she felt his mana wash over her and the spell laid itself on her. She turned to go, then paused. "You've done well, Sir Derek," she said. "If Regina has any sense, she will know she can trust you by now." The man raised an eyebrow in surprise, then half shrugged, half nodded. "I won't say no to that," he said. "Also, you do know I am not a knight. Eminent mistress. I also know humans can use titles in different ways." She rolled her eyes slightly. But it was really time to go now, so she tested his spell by starting to run. As always, it was good work. It would have been easier to fly, but she was confident that going on foot would be stealthier than using a flying drone. Regina had already promised to send several drones as high as they could go, then bring them down further inside the border of Esimon, so they could, if possible, come pick her up later, if she wanted to travel deeper into Esimon quickly. For now, Madress continued on her own, relying on her magical senses more than her psychic ones, for once. It was not outside the realm of possibility the Esimon had laid an alarm line, like the one Cernlia had maintained against monster waves. It turned out to be a good thing that she was vigilant. It should have been dark, but the night was lit by stars and a crescent moon, shining down with more than enough light for not just a dark elf to see, but presumably also humans. At least those accustomed to it. But the border region was almost desolate. In the gloom, it looked like some forbidding moonscape. Wherever that word came from, she'd have to ask Regina. Madress stuck to lower terrain where possible, following shallow ravines where they existed. There was a road, used for trade, though not very much used now. She avoided it. Madress found the first magical tripwire when she was less than halfway to the first Esimon settlement. She slowed down, then halted, focusing on her magical senses. It was long, but certainly not long enough to cover the entire area. There were several others, further off, though. They were staggered, not covering the entire perimeter at once, but still canvassing the field and probably crossing any direct path across the border. Still, it meant it was possible to avoid them. She followed this line until she found a weak point at the end, then used some of her mana, exhaling it to brush lightly across the construct, and jumped over the line. She held her breath and waited for a long moment, but it had worked. The mana didn't change and no alarm was sent out. From there, Madress picked her way more carefully forward. She detoured to the side, hugging one of the lines and slipping into the gap between two further ones. Still, she didn't assume she was safe, but kept scanning for more, better hidden lines. There was nothing to find, though. Apparently, the Esimon don't expect the Empire to attack from here. Which made some sense, strategically. Or they had simply assumed they'd see an attack coming and didn't need alarms. As Madress finally neared the actual territory of Esimon, beyond where a border might lie on a map, she conceded that they had clearly made decent preparations. Unlike the Empire's preparations, they were apparently not even building fences, but there was an obvious outpost or fort of some size. Still a little too small to be called a proper castle, though it was obviously a fortification to anchor the border. While she was curious to see what it looked like up close, Madress decided not to risk it. She didn't want her little trip to be brought to an end this quickly, and instead kept her distance from it, going in an arc around the fort. She could still sense people on the walls, the night guard. They were just humans, though, and they had little chance of seeing her in the darkness from this distance. More interestingly, their psychic signatures matched others she was picking up from farther away. In fact, yes, now that she focused on it, there were very similar patterns in both directions parallel to the border from outpost. And beyond. They had clearly built a line of fortifications. The Empire had, of course, been aware of at least some of those in principle, but it was good to get confirmation. Madress passed them by, making sure to stick to the darkest regions and to mute her psychic and magical presence as much as possible. It did not take long to see the first villages and towns, which she avoided for now. Instead, she tried to find King Stephen and the Order of the Sun Temple fighters with him who had escaped from Prian. Unfortunately, it was not as easy as she had hoped. She was starting to get tired, the effects of the haste spell slowly wearing off. She had hoped that they would be at least as tired as her and stop somewhere to sleep after their escape, maybe in one of these little towns. That didn't seem to be the case. They might have already been picked up and perhaps flown somewhere else. Madress stopped inside a small glade of trees, letting herself drop to the mossy ground and trying not to slump in relief. She closed her eyes anyway and took a minute to gather herself. She hadn't felt this kind of exhaustion since the War of the Coalitions, which she usually avoided thinking about. Promising herself to examine her feelings in more depth later, Madress instead focused on the outside world, casting out her senses to locate her quarry. There. It was, in the end, not too difficult to find them. As she'd expected, they were still traveling, and in a large enough group that it was hard to miss them once she looked in their general area. Well, the group she found only seemed to consist of the king and a few senior people from Prian and the Order, so their number had been greatly reduced. Over half of them were currently asleep, making their minds harder to detect, including the king, who was the most distinctive and thus should be easiest to find, which probably explained why she'd missed him at first. Madress opened her eyes, stood, stretched and kept walking. At the same time, she focused her attention on the sky above her and called to the small group of drones she found. She had to slow down and wait at the edge of the small wood, it was easiest to hide here. The drone that finally set down in front of her was an unusual specimen, clearly the product of Regina experimenting with them again. She was not an expert in biology, but the construction of its ribcage clearly hinted at increased lung capacity. Its shell seemed thicker and more widely spread than most drones, rougher to the touch when she reached out. Its limbs were thin and stubby, the base of the wings broad. She could sense overwhelmingly from the drone that it was cold, even now, despite the adaptations that should have helped it deal with low temperatures. It must have flown quite high on its Hive Queen's orders. High enough to avoid detection. Madress climbed on a bit gingerly, patting the drone. "Keep flying northeast," she told it. "I will show you the direction. Alert me if you sense anything out of the ordinary or any other people at all." The drone just looked at her, and she sighed slightly. Up. It crouched slightly, then jumped into the air and beat its wings. Madress leaned forward, downright lying on top of the drone. It was surprisingly comfortable. She was glad she'd dressed warmly despite the running, making sure her jacket was closed and pulling on her gloves from a pocket. Then she closed her eyes, searched for the drone's mind and imprinted on it the location of their goal, the city she was fairly sure her quarry was traveling toward, the central hub of this part of Esimon. Then she tried to sleep for a few hours. It worked surprisingly well, despite the awkward position and the wind. She was exhausted and had slept in worse places. Besides, mastering their own mind was always the first step to mastery for a psychic. However, the skill to truly control her dreams still eluded Madress, and anyone she spoke to, no matter what they claimed, and her dreams were uneasy, plagued by new shapes and scenes. Instead of any coherent story, even a bizarre one, they were just chaotic, disconnected flashes and sudden surges of emotion. As she finally woke fully and blinked the sleep from her eyes, she knew the reason. She had battled Helen inside her own mind. While she'd been more focused on neutralizing and subduing her opponent in the present, inevitably she'd picked up details from her mind, including quite a bit of useful information she had already passed on to Regina, but also more personal snippets of life, if there was a difference. To the pits with it, I still like her a little, Madress admitted to herself. Helen had not been her favorite student, if she'd had any, but Madress had respected her drive and ambition. She did not like the idea of Helen getting killed, even if the woman deserved it. Someone else who'd seen Regina's decisions over the years might doubt whether Regina meant to execute Helen, but Madress didn't. She knew the Empress better than that. No one would protest Helen's death, and she was an active threat. Regina wouldn't hesitate at all to chop off her head. Ironically, she might be more hesitant about trying to wring out every drop of information from her first. Flying all alone above the clouds over Esimon, Madress had too much time to think. She pondered whether she had let her feelings get in the way. Had she, however subconsciously or indirectly, allowed Helen to escape? She didn't come to an answer that satisfied her. A low trill from the drone brought her attention back to the present, and Madress instinctively looked around to see whether anyone had heard them, but they were alone in the sky. She was confident she would have sensed it and woken had they come close to any other people, anyhow. But now they were approaching a large city. Resting had allowed her to regain some strength, at least. Madress readied herself to apply a subtle veil over herself and her mount as they continued, and searched for her targets again. It seemed she was just in time. They'd just entered the outskirts of the city and were now making their way farther in. It would be interesting to see where exactly they went and who they talked to, but that would still take a bit of time. After a moment, she closed her eyes and connected more closely to the mind of the drone. Its eyes were better than hers, especially when it came to seeing from this high up, and she asked for its vision of the city. Immediately, it was obvious that the Esimon were mustering military forces. A sizable army camp had been placed just outside the city gates. It was not surprising, although she noted the separation. By her estimate, at least 10,000 solders were inside the camp. More of them could be in the city. It was hard to discern them from the minds of the populace at large. There could be up to 30,000 men here, but this was not likely to be their sole or even main force. They also had an impressive, at least by past standards, collection of tamed monsters and flying beasts. None of that was altogether surprising, so after Madress was sure she had impressed the information in her mind, she moved on. She tried to look for King Stephen again, but then paused. His mind was slightly distinct, interestingly, not as much as his mana signature was, if one looked closely, but still just a little. And now, looking deeper into the city and trying to sift the minds of the people there, she had picked up several ones distinct in a similar way. Several more, and then even more. There were quite a few here. Half a dozen, no, over a dozen people. Champions of the gods. She blinked, sinking forward to lay her cheek against the shell of the drone, and looked at the city below. We thought it was just special circumstances and an important choice, and I suppose it still was, but Stephen is clearly not the only one Giudiarno selected. And the same goes for the other gods. If there were already so many champions here, even if you were generous and assumed that most of the champions in Esimon or beyond were gathered here, perhaps joined by a delegation from the Western Confederation, there were probably still more elsewhere. This was unprecedented. Madress sighed. Her priorities had changed. She'd try to send a message back, and she also needed to be careful and return quickly to let Regina know. This was clearly vital information about their enemy's strategy. Trying to compensate for technology with divine power? Hard to know whether that would work or not. Chapter 385, Resolve. If there was one thing the recent fighting had made easier, it was getting a firmer estimate of the number of monsters in the area, and how their movement patterns changed day to day. Of course, the movement of troops and the battles in Prian, even if they were comparatively subdued, disrupted and obscured some of that activity. It made it harder to guess how the monsters would act if everything was calm. Still, the increase in activity was obvious. And this war only made it more dangerous. They needed to stop it. They couldn't afford to have their soldiers occupied protecting their citizens from monsters when they might face an attack from Esimon. Tim was still in Prian. He oversaw the securing of the city and towns of the small kingdom, as well as the tunnels leading to Esimon and further afield. Tia had gone to join him briefly to oversee the technical aspects of fortifying the area. June should have stayed as well, but everyone wanted her out of danger for now. Or at least out of that specific dangerous area. All of that was why Janice had come here. They needed to finally deal with this issue, and she was also curious what they would find in this excavation. Ironically, the war made it easier for her to be here without drawing too much attention. Besides it being a general distraction, no one questioned her departing for the east, and it was plausible enough that she might visit some secret installation or random outpost where the Empire would marshal troops. She just couldn't stay too long. Madress' absence was keenly missed, but she had concluded that they couldn't afford to wait for her, and everyone agreed. Instead, June and Edmund would have to shoulder the psychic burden, with Regina watching and hopefully helping from further away. Ices and Galatea were also here, ready to help. With them, Zephyr and, with all due humility, herself, Janice was confident they had all the magical firepower and skill they needed. Not that she was really calling the shots here, whatever her official rank might say. This was Galatia's show in a way that no other project she had been involved in before was. At least that was Janice's impression. It might also be because Janice had come so late and was obviously less involved than the others. Right now, it didn't seem to matter as they all stood in the tunnel, pressed uncomfortably close together, looking at the wall and the door in front of them. Parts of the wall had been carefully stripped away to expose some of the metal, and, apparently, more exotic substances, winding through it like veins. Most of the symbols on the door itself glowed now, though thankfully not all of them. The glow shifted and changed, more intensely in some glyphs than others, but she had looked closely and long enough to notice that the fluctuation was there for all of them, actually. Janice could almost sense the pulse of magic through the entire structure, like the pounding of some great drum too low to hear but which you could still feel in your bones, or like the tide, regular and powerful and dangerous. It was hard to really categorize the magic or the sense she got of it, it was too different from most of what she'd seen before. How long will this take? June asked after they stood in silence. We should be clear to approach soon, Isay said calmly. Janice frowned. She knew she didn't understand everything that was going on here in detail. There hadn't been enough time. But she got the gist of it, and she could sense it. Isay's was lightly pushing on the magic in the doorway. Calmly, Janice reached out, pressing her own mana out and joining the elf's. It was difficult and delicate, requiring a sort of mana control that most spells didn't, but the basic premise wasn't too different from what she'd done before. She'd done exercises that were more difficult, too. Why don't you concentrate on shielding our minds, she said absently. Janice could sense the pressure against her mind, like someone was squeezing a band around her head, except one that penetrated deeper than the skull. She'd been working on her mental shields, so it was bearable, just a little distracting. Plus, she still sensed Regina's presence, hovering somewhere in the back of her mind, watching and waiting. Isay and Zephyr stepped forward, and Janice joined them, walking slightly behind them. Zephyr conjured a flame and started holding it up to the door, tracing a path through it. Isay used something closer to magic missiles or shields connected to her hands instead. Janice monitored their progress, then stepped up to join them, making space for Tia to come up beside her. She raised her hands and laid them on the left side of the door in spots she'd memorized, slowly pushing in some of her mana. Most of their work had been done already, identifying which parts of this entire construct were probably related to the monster activity, which corresponded to power supply or transmission, alarms or sensors, or wards. It gave them a roadmap forward. There had still been heated discussions about how they should proceed, but Janice clung to the confidence they had. At first, they'd hoped they could just get the door to open by itself, once it recognized someone whitelisted to be allowed entry. Unfortunately, that clearly didn't work, either its systems had degraded or, before this was buried, it had been locked up entirely, or even restricted to certain specific people who were long dead. Putting a hive kind in front of the door wasn't enough, although if Regina could make it here, that technically might be. Regardless, they knew this doorway would have backup systems, and a degree of almost adaptable or smart programming, in Regina's words. It was apparently almost a bit like a computer system, though Janice only had a vague idea of what that even actually meant. There would be some kind of basic code, some safety measures, resets, or something. Galatea at least seemed confident in that. Now the metaform floated forward, going to the sides of the door, where they'd carefully exposed some of the underlying construction. Originally they'd considered simply going around the doorway, but the builders had clearly thought of that possibility and the magical shielding was just as strong here as it was on the door itself. The meters of stone once you got past the edges of the doorway helped, too. But it was still a bit easier to actually get to what she called the hardware here. Janice felt Galatea's magic snap out suddenly, severing wires and connections forged in mana simultaneously. She leaned forward in response, still emitting a constant trickle of mana, and used some of her mana to conjure exotic elements she barely understood, that she had learned just enough chemistry to make a few grams of, but knew how their magical properties would react here. The door almost seemed to shiver slightly, and beads of sweat dropped down her forehead as Janice had to mentally wrestle with her mana to stay under control. The drumming against her head grew to the point that she couldn't ignore it, and the world seemed to sway around her. For a long moment, it was like the doorway and the tunnel warped around her, and it took all her willpower not to throw herself away from the door. Then June cried out lowly, without words, and Janice vaguely felt her crash to her knees, as she evidently wrested control of the mental effect. The razor wire trying to drill into her head eased off, returning to roughly the same pressure. Now, Galatea said. "We are the Starlit Hive," Tia spoke beside her, her voice strained but clear. "Of the hive kind, of the eclectic hives, those who embrace our fate and our allies, of the work of the Esimon, of the family line of this hive and its builders. Alate, Esimon, Retakroare." She thrust her hand right into the small circle formed by an intricate twisting of letters in the bottom center of the door. Light flashed. It was like all the light that had gathered to light up the glyphs on the door now fled towards the center, shining under and through her hand, enough to show the shell and bone structure almost like X-rays. Janice could sense a spike of pain from Tia, but she kept her hand steady. Galatea moved her own mana at the same time, and Janice retreated a step, looking closely. They had cut off parts of the whole structure now, and the charge in the central part was clearly wavering. If they'd done this correctly, the central core should have reset, its sensors damaged and partly removed but not entirely unavailable, and the defensive measures decoupled and disarmed. The mental force exerted on them seemed to increase for a moment, then flickered. It felt a little like she was standing on a drone suddenly diving, and then it disappeared. Invisible bands loosened and Janice could finally breathe freely again. The light flashed, then seemed to drain into the inside of the door, and it rumbled. Galatea stepped back, and Janice grabbed Tia's shoulder, dragging her back a step, too. Just in time as the door moved. It split into fourths, the panel sliding back at an angle, into the space beyond along the floor and ceiling. It looked weird, but Janice was too focused on looking at what was behind the door to care. Of course, it was dark. Janice blinked and squinted, absently casting spark to give them a bit more light. She heard Tia breathing in sharply, probably able to see a little more. Without waiting for them, Galatea advanced. Janice glanced at the others, then followed her. At first glance, the complex behind the doorway was the same as the rest, built similarly, with corridors and rooms in stone and metal. But on second glance, it was clear this wasn't like the base they'd found in the south. There were obvious signs of a battle here. Entire chunks of stone, cement, were ripped out of the walls and ceiling, parts of it littering the floor. And that was the least of it. She could see metal sheets entirely warped, a withered hole in the ground deep enough to show only darkness. And there were even a few scattered pieces of equipment, most of them rusted, some stained. No bodies right by the door, thankfully. "Ah, I see," Isays hummed, staring at something to the side. Looking that way, Janice saw there was a kind of pillar or maybe a box of cement or something, slightly recessed on the wall of the chamber, with letters carved into it. Or more precisely, into plates affixed to it. They were dark, not glowing. She recognized a few words, but couldn't make much sense of the text. "I think we were lucky this worked," Galatea commented. "We are lucky this never blew up at all," Isays corrected. "They rigged this to explode, I believe. Perhaps as a fail-safe measure. Apparently, our tactic worked and what was left of the security mechanism decided to let us in." On second thought, it did look a bit like a warning label. Janice swallowed, trying not to show the prickling on her neck. She'd known something like this was a possibility, in theory, but still. She was glad to have apparently avoided it. As far as she knew, Tia's little speech and the bits of Esimon she'd used had been pretty cobbled together, but maybe they'd helped, or the installation was just good enough to recognize hive kind and had defaulted to allow them entry. Then again, for the war this had been built for, were fancy details needed? They were isolated bearers of their civilization and culture stranded on a foreign planet, set against everyone. And the hives had lost. She was forcefully reminded of that as they continued, through the antechamber and through another doorway into what looked like the main room behind this last defense. It was bigger than expected, with tall ceilings, several doors at the end, a few lowered sections inset in the ground with a different material that looked springy, and several panels on the wall that reflected the light they brought with them, illuminating the space. But Janice barely took this in, because she was too focused on the bodies they also found. There were a few drones. They all looked young. In human terms, maybe 15 or so. Maybe older, but not quite fully grown adults yet. They laid on the floor, and she could immediately see what they had died of. One was missing all of their right limbs, one had a hole in her chest, one had his throat cut. What struck her was how similar to the starlit hive they looked, even if they were different. The body types were wrong, the shell color had a bit more variety and reached darker tones. One was an almost greenish-gray and one a dark earthy brown, more similar to a human trader she'd once seen, though maybe he'd been demi-human, but they were still recognizably hive drones, sapient ones. Janice still remembered when she'd first seen the hive, she knew how the drones had grown. Max had definitely been bigger than them after a few weeks, and he'd lived in the wilderness after hatching. She could also guess how they'd died. Someone cursed lowly, she thought it was Tia, but Janice was too distracted to check. The young drones were arranged almost in a star pattern, laid around the center of their group. Their Hive Queen. Unlike her children, they must have been of one hive, their mother had been killed differently. She was not lying down, but was instead still standing upright, as if frozen in time, although that wasn't it. Her shell was the color of stone. They must have used a skill, Isays finally said, breaking the silence. Petrification. I've seen it used before with magic, it was slightly different. The coloration, there is a gradient. It went up from her feet to her head. Well, Janice thought, a bit detached, that would explain the horror on her face, anyway. She's so young, Galatea muttered. Janice took a step closer and to the side, very careful to avoid the drones' bodies, to look at the Hive Queen more fully. She really was young, she looked even younger than her drones. Of course, Hive Queens probably matured a bit more slowly. This one was about as big as Janice had been at 13. Her face was set in an expression of horror and anguish, her torso angled slightly as if she'd tried to lean away. Her wings were curled on her back, maybe they hadn't developed far enough to be usable yet? But her hands were slightly outstretched, held low, as if she'd instinctively tried reaching for her drones. We don't know how old her soul was, Tia said, sounding as if she was reminding herself as much as them. No, but if she is like Regina, she lost her memories of her life before, Janice said, shaking her head. Though hopefully she kept more of it. Gods, she must have hatched directly before the cataclysm, or even after. Probably after. We do know none of the original Hive Queens coming to this world survived it, Galatea said. And neither did the others survive the crusade against them, Tia muttered. Janice glanced at her, trying to send a bit of reassurance through the psychic link, but she could tell they were both affected by the sight. Personally, she felt a bit like she had missed a step going down a staircase, except it wasn't just a single moment. She'd been aware of the genocide that the people after the cataclysm had committed against the hive kind, of course, but it was different to have such a tangible reminder right in front of her. These hive kind and their fates, this wasn't just war, they hadn't died in battle, but worse. They'd been hunted down. There must have been quicker ways to kill them, but someone had wanted to play with their food. And this young Hive Queen was Regina's family, which made it their family, her family. Janice didn't know how Regina would feel about that, but she knew this reminder would strengthen her resolve. She looked at the macabre tableau and let it strengthen her own resolve. Chapter 386, Legacy. Regina had started experimenting with new templates for swarm drones and had established a few new such templates she tended to return to, since she got her new abilities and her most recent tier increase. As the description for Hive's past promised, she was able to direct the growth of her swarm more directly and even almost automate it to a degree. It had led her to developing a few combinations of things from classes and other stuff that she found useful for certain tasks. One of the major projects she had started much earlier and continued was to train swarm drones to better relay her own mind, presence, and orders, effectively acting like a double for her, even though Regina now used classes and such modifications rather than just trying to brute force it. The drone she had sent to the excavation site was the pinnacle of what she had achieved in this effort recently. It actually had wings that resembled her own in form. Not so much because it needed to fly, as to increase the resonance between her own body and the drone's. It was also roughly her size and shape, bigger than many flying drones. Its voice box and vocal cords were shaped to allow for speech much more easily than typical swarm drones. And it was gaining in levels, but she wasn't worrying about what would happen when it reached sapience. Currently, Regina was focused on her surroundings. Using the drone's body, she walked down the tunnel in solemn silence. As she came to the next larger cavern, several drones lined it, standing still as honor guards and marking the ceremonial atmosphere. She brushed briefly against their minds and continued. The doorway was interesting, but Regina passed it by, instead continuing into the main cavern of the deeper section behind it. Janice waited for her, with several others present and watching quietly as well. Finally, she came to a stop in front of the dead Hive Queen and her drones. Regina looked at them in silence. Janice shuffled a little closer, reaching out with her mind to subtly project support. Since Regina's actual body was farther away, it seemed muffled to her, but she appreciated it, still. She felt like she should say something, but she was drawing a blank. Rest in peace, Regina finally murmured. They didn't look very peaceful. She could all too easily imagine her own drones in the place of those killed here, looking at them. They were astoundingly well preserved, due to the lack of airflow or maybe a side effect from whatever had turned their queen to stone. On an impulse, she added, "You are not alone now. Your death was a horrible atrocity, but you did not die for nothing. I will make sure of that, sister. Your memory will not be forgotten." They stayed silent for a long minute. "There is a good chance she actually was your sister," Janice finally said. Regina glanced at her, almost glad for the excuse to stop looking at the dead Hive Queen who did, in fact, look a lot like she herself had in the early weeks. "Are you only saying that because she looks like she could be?" she asked, tilting her head. "I mean, Lion did say that as far as she knew, all Hive Queens going to Haven were related within a few generations. So I suppose she could be my sister or my second cousin. And that's obviously just regarding biological relation, not counting our souls." Which wasn't supposed to dismiss it, the biological part did matter. "Mostly yes," Janice admitted. "But there's also something we found in the back rooms. Come on, I think you want to see that anyway. It's pretty impressive. We're very lucky that everything here survived the centuries so well." Regina nodded, throwing a last look at the dead drones in the middle of the room before she followed Janice. Several of the other people in the room, who had kept back and stayed pretty quiet so far, followed them. They found Tia quickly, in one of the adjacent rooms. There were several of those, and they also seemed to be connected to each other. These rooms were much smaller. One of them had a raised floor made from a different material, tiled in some kind of organic-looking material she didn't recognize, although it might have been a variant of production drone's secretions. She could immediately tell that it had been a bedroom/nest. Tia was in the one beside it, but Regina still found her eyes drawn to it. There were decorations in all of the rooms. Some were pictures or other handcrafted things hung on the walls, but more often the walls were painted directly. It must have been done by the drones living here. They varied a bit, although there was a standard style Regina vaguely recognized. It looked a little like the kind of Eastern animation you might find in her old life, which should have seemed incongruous with this old hive-kind burrow, and yet didn't. It gave an impression like kids painting their bedroom. Maybe she was a hobby artist, Regina reflected. The walls of the bedroom were almost fully covered, with climbing and twisting vines framing other objects hidden in their branches and scenes positioned in the gaps between them. It was impressive. "Mother," Tia greeted her, tilting her head a bit, her attention clearly still partway on what she was looking at. "Do you think they knew what would happen?" Regina hesitated as she stopped in the room the farthest back of the entire complex. It was small, but housed several podiums. All but one of them seemed to be hollow. Actually, maybe they had been covered by something that had rotted away? Tia and a few other drones were very carefully, mostly with magic or the aid of protective gloves, extracting things from them. Then her gaze came to rest on the wall behind her and Regina bit down on another comment. "Possibly," she said softly, instead. "They had painted more of a tree this time instead of climbing vines, although the tree was made of colored streaks of light in a more abstract fashion. In regular spacing along the tree, other pictures were placed. They contained a variety of shapes, but the main pictures were clearly portraits. "This is you," Janice said quietly, nodding at one point on the wall. Regina had to make the drone she rode with crouch and lean to the side to see. It was the furthest painting down and to the left. There was a small cluster of shapes, pictures vaguely arranged on egg-shaped dark backgrounds. 3 of these shapes held only one picture each. They didn't use a photorealistic style, but they were clearly of human women. The one furthest to the side did look like the photo she'd seen. Regina looked at the others, then at the one other person who was sort of in the same sequence, who'd been placed a bit removed from the rest. Like most of the other people in this roster, clearly arranged in the form of a family tree but also in other groups given the placement, there were 2 pictures. One was of a young Hive Queen, the one she had seen petrified. The picture beside it was of a young woman, perhaps 20 or so, with sandy hair but darker skin and a bright smile. She took a step back. There were about a dozen women in total displayed here. The painter, or painters, had chosen subtly different background shades and contours, with the ones farther above ringed in a dark green and the others in a dark blue. The style was also slightly different. And the older ones, well, looked older. "I wish they'd added names," Regina commented quietly. It felt ungrateful when she'd already gotten more information from this than she'd ever thought she would, but the words still slipped out. "They must have had a reason not to," Janice said. "Maybe a few of them had family that was still alive?" Regina hummed in response, quietly watching the wall, before she made herself turn to focus on the rest of the room. "These were obviously built quickly, you can see imperfections and signs they were roughly shaped," Tia said after a moment, nodding at the pedestals, or containers. Looking at them more closely, Regina saw she was right. The edges weren't always smooth, and the dimensions didn't seem to be entirely regular. "What did they leave behind for us?" she asked. She could faintly sense several of their minds darkening at her phrasing, but no one was surprised or contradicted her. It was obvious to everyone here that these people had not prepared all of this just for their own hive. They'd probably at least suspected what was coming. Maybe they'd done this while shut up here, their last gate under assault. "Unfortunately, not as much as we might have hoped," Tia said. "Most of it seems to have decayed. It seems they didn't anticipate this having to last for 1,000 years." She shrugged. "Incidentally, it seems they used some kind of production drone substance to cover these compartments as well as the murals. I found traces of it on them. Probably something that was intended to decay at some point within a given timeframe." Regina grimaced. That made some sense and answered the question of why it hadn't all been destroyed. She stepped closer, looking at what Tia pointed out. The murals were obviously faded, but their depictions were still clearly visible. That didn't surprise her so much. There'd been plenty of medieval murals older than this that had survived back then, though they were probably gone now. Like so much of Earth's history. Unfortunately, the collection Tia showed her now had generally suffered more. Some metal parts were still intact, though often a bit rusted judging by the coloration. But there must have also been organic parts, which were decayed. "There are some parchments, I think," Tia explained, carefully showing her a few sheets. "I'm not sure what they were made of, probably not sheepskin. I think we can carefully reconstruct at least some of their contents, but it will take delicate work." Regina looked closer, absently tugging on her mandible in her own body. She could tell the pages themselves had stood the test of time relatively well. They'd been kept dry and in the dark. But the old hive kind might not have chosen the best ink for them, and how would they have known? It was a rather niche skill, and it had clearly not worked as well. It was very faint on the page, sometimes blurred. Still, she looked closer, instinctively trying to make the drone squint at it, trying to make out what the text said. She got a few words. It didn't seem to be a historical record, to her mild disappointment. But instead there was some discussion of magic? Mana was mentioned several times, if she wasn't wrong. And, actually, that seemed like names of other worlds? And there were a few words written in what seemed like Esimon script, with transliterations in parentheses behind them, so they were clearly explaining some concepts. They seemed like technical terms anyway. Or maybe she was projecting. Regina glanced at the others, and only just caught Janice and Jay exchanging a look. Janice seemed slightly disgusted but fascinated, Jay mostly calm but curious. She wasn't sure what that was about. By now, Ices and Zephyr had also found their way here, looking at the mural and the pillars only in passing, and carrying on a murmured conversation. And where was Galatea, anyway? Regina really wished she could be here in person. It would be easier to sense everyone without having to look up on the surface, apparently looking at some of their previous finds. As Regina focused on her, she could tell Galatea was leaving, probably heading back to join them. I believe we might have missed something here, Ices said, cocking her head and frowning slightly as she glanced at the wall. Let us see. Curious, Regina followed her into the next room, after making sure the documents were secure. This room looked similar to those before. Ices glanced around, before pointing them to a dark shadow in the corner. It only took Regina a moment to realize what they were seeing. There was a small bolt hole in the wall. They'd probably covered it with more of their camouflage material, but little of that was left. This wall was painted in sweeping colors, though, and this part was black and dark gray, so the black of the opening didn't stand out at first glance in the low light. It was also quite small, barely enough for a drone to squeeze through. Tia crouched and looked through it. A small space, bare and stony, she reported. It's empty. Regina gently pushed her aside and tried to squeeze through herself. It was a bit of a test of her control of the drone. She paused, glancing at the others. Light, please. She hadn't experimented with it much, but trying to do magic from this distance wouldn't go well. With sparks from Janice and Ices lighting her way, it was easier to push through until she ended up in a small crawl space that looked like it was roughly hewn out of bare rock. She stretched her drone's arms out, touching the walls. There was only enough space for maybe 2 drones here. Sighing, Regina got back out. It wasn't much to see. I guess now we know what happened and why the door was still closed, she said. Janice nodded. A few drones must have managed to hide out here and survived. Then they made sure everything was preserved, left, repaired the door if it was damaged and closed it. Regina grimaced slightly. She wondered what had happened to the hypothetical drones, but had a feeling she knew. They wouldn't survive long on their own in a world trying to kill them. Most likely they died fighting a while later, possibly on purpose. She could picture her own drones deciding to go out taking as many enemies with them as possible, but she pushed that thought aside. I don't understand, Ices said. Why didn't they hide the Hive Queen here, if they had this hideaway? Surely it would have been the best chance. Isn't it obvious? Regina didn't even have to consider it. She glanced at Tia. Their enemies would have never stopped and would have turned everything over until they found her. They knew she was here. They would have all died. This way, at least a few of her children survived. Folding her hands, she returned to the main room, not looking back. She was already feeling a bit emotionally drained, but she still had work to do. At least they'd managed to salvage something from this. Regina still had to talk to the gnomes, deal with the Prince of Elikand, send someone to get the Dark Elves' maps of their tunnels, and make sure she knew what the psychics in the area were up to. And, of course, double-check that the monster activity in the region was at least starting to decrease. That had been why they'd decided to do this now, she'd almost forgotten. And if she was focusing on work to try to avoid musing on what she had found and what this meant for her, well, she had her duties. She'd give herself a bit of time, and consider it with the care it deserved. Chapter 387, By the Sword. Previously, Galatea hadn't had the time or opportunity to really appreciate Prian. She'd been too focused on getting into the castle, the fight, making sure June and the others were fine. Not that she had missed very much, she mused now as she looked down at the castle and the city beside it. It wasn't a particularly large city, or particularly well kept. She'd seen worse, but it wouldn't win any beauty awards. Not that there were such things. Galatea supposed it did have a certain charm. The architecture was similar but subtly different to Cernlia. Their roofs were a little more peaked, more snowfall, she wondered. Or just a matter of culture, There were a lot of poplar and chestnut trees that seemed popular here, and people decorated their homes with little carvings or even statuettes of monsters. Fortunately, she was not here to admire the architecture or culture. Strictly speaking, she had little business here, but Galatea was curious. She'd seen the Empire's military in action before, but it had been a while, and it hadn't really been the Imperial military back then, at least not like it was currently. And now it occupied a human town, not a gnomish one, and Regina's conquests in Nerlia had been with the Hive almost exclusively. Besides, she felt a little obligated to stick around and keep an eye on Leanne. She had brought the psychic here, after all. It was a little funny how no one really seemed to know what to do with her. The local leaders of the city, mostly lower nobles and merchant guild heads, that the Imperials interacted with treated her with cautious respect. As if they were unsure of her position but trying not to offend just to be safe. The Imperial officers weren't that different. Leanne probably didn't help her case by hanging around and listening to conversations almost at random. She'd spoken to June before the young princess had been sent back, and with Tim a few times, but didn't seem to be doing much otherwise. "Are you bored?" Galatea asked her straight out. Leanne raised an eyebrow at the question. She'd wandered up to join Galatea seemingly on a whim. They were standing on what used to be the roof of a building in the inner yard of the castle. It had suffered some in the fight and was now little more than a skeleton with one wall mostly caved in. It didn't bother Galatea, but organics might risk a collapse by going up here. "You're the first person to ask," the woman said. "Well spotted." "Yes, as a matter of fact, I am. I might just go challenge the soldiers to arm wrestling if I don't find something else soon." "You could always go back and go do, well, whatever you usually do," Galatea pointed out. "Not everyone has a convenient teleportation spell," Leanne answered. "I'd have to get back the hard way. And besides, I can't just leave. I helped the Empire take this city and its people. I should at least be here to see what they are doing with their spoils. And I did say I would consider whether I will further aid your empire." "Still not my empire," Galatea murmured. "But yes, that makes sense. It's good that you want to assure yourself of what's going on personally. Though you could always go and ask Tim for some task to stay busy. Or he could ask Regina for you." "First names, HM?" "I wonder," Leanne asked, stepping closer with light steps. "Is it strange to be living this close to royals?" "You are not one of them." Galatea didn't turn. "I am not one of any group." "True," Leanne mused. "Is it not lonely?" Galatea tried not to get angry at all the pushing. "You seem to think I share human frailties. What makes you think loneliness is universal?" she pointed out a bit more coldly. "Human frailties, huh?" Leanne chuckled shortly. Must have touched a nerve. "All right, if you say so, Lady Galatea. I'll stop asking. Was there something else you wanted?" Galatea asked, still a bit curtly. The psychic actually took half a step back this time, inclining her head. "Actually, I was going to ask for an introduction to the Dark Elves. Or tips for approaching them." Galatea frowned. "I'm afraid I can't help you with an introduction," she said. She was going to go talk to the local Dark Elves, but she hadn't been focused on that. "Aren't you an associate of Madress, though? Just introduce yourself with that, I'm sure they'll be happy to talk to you." "All right," Leanne nodded. "And you could take a gift to be polite," Galatea added. "Just please don't use classified information. Some wine or imported food would be fine." "I'll do that. Thank you." Galatea turned back around, absently watching as Leanne hesitated, then started to leave. She frowned. She was in a bad mood, but maybe she'd been taking it out on her a little. Sighing and watching the air pressure fluctuate around her, Galatea moved, floating down the abandoned building and then further towards the city. She was going to talk to Tim, or maybe find a few other people. She didn't have to be a psychic to sense the tension in the air, the anxiety of the populace. It had eased slightly, though. People were filling the streets again, going about their business, perhaps a little more hesitantly than before, but they were doing it. The Imperial army had moved in quickly. After most of the fighting had taken place in the castle, and they'd established control without any burning, looting or any atrocities. There was a curfew and the occasional patrolling group of soldiers. While the locals kept their distance from them, they'd clearly stopped being too afraid that the soldiers would act out. Galatea would bet many of them had hidden their valuables somewhere, and were slowly returning them now. There had been a little discontent among the soldiers, but Tim seemed to have stamped it out quickly. The Imperial Army was a new thing, and they had higher standards for discipline than most would be used to, but they were all professionals now. Galatea knew how hard Ben and the others had worked to ingrain a certain spirit in them, pride connected to serving their nation but also serving the people, protecting the helpless, acting with honor, all that stuff. Many of them might not even realize how much their own conceptions of honor had shifted. Galatea glanced at the soldiers as she passed. Unsurprisingly, she caught a few laughing with young locals. They seemed more wary of the sapient drones here, but those weren't the majority, and they had made an effort of being approachable. The humans were probably helping the economy in other ways. It was still not that late, but she could already hear the music coming from a nearby tavern and sense the number of people gathered there. She paused as she neared a square shortly after the tavern. The city was just big enough to have more than one gathering place, so while this wasn't the main town square, it was a plaza large enough for a crowd to form, which it had. Interestingly, there appeared to be a mix of locals and Imperials. And as she watched, Tim appeared, striding through the men who parted for him and talking to several of them at the front. There was a soldier with a bloody nose and who was missing his jacket, another group of soldiers milling around close by, and several civilians, by their dress, along with a few officers. Curious, Galatea walked through the crowd, smiling at the gathered people as they parted to let her through. She examined the scene, starting to suspect where this was going. Tim was not wearing his uniform or a crown, but he had changed into more elaborate attire, this time a richly decorated tunic with a gold-lined half-cape that left his blade arms free but looked suitably dramatic. There was no doubt who was in charge as he talked to the officers. As Galatea approached, they stopped and turned, and Tim nodded at her. "Hello, Galatea. I don't suppose you caught what happened?" She shook her head. "I was elsewhere, I am simply here out of curiosity." "What did happen?" Tim glanced at the disheveled soldier she now realized was guarded by two others. "It appears to be a case of attempted assault, and we must pronounce justice." Galatea looked around again, stepping closer. "This requires your personal presence?" "I was around, anyway." Tim sighed. "I was hoping we would be able to make it without one case like this." That made things clearer. It was probably a case of sexual assault. Galatea glanced at the locals again. One of the women and one of the men were clearly shaken, most of the rest of the women and all of the men looked angry. If she recalled, the Imperial Army's regulations considered rape a capital offense, punishable by hanging, and they didn't distinguish between attempted or otherwise. "I understand your wrath, good people," Tim called to them, turning so he could be heard by the crowd. "I promise you that justice will be done. The Empire does not condone its soldiers acting like brigands, and crimes committed will be punished harshly. But we are also dedicated to upholding law and order, and we do not condemn someone without hearing evidence. This man will be tried by a military tribunal. If he is found guilty, which I think likely, he will hang. I will oversee it personally." There was some muttering from the crowd, but they seemed reasonably content with his declaration. Or at least reserving judgment. "What about the assault on me?" the soldier asked. He tried to step forward, but the other two soldiers grabbed his arms. "Prince Tim, I'm innocent, I swear I didn't want to hurt anyone. But I was hurt, too." Tim briefly glanced at another soldier. It took Galatea a moment to realize this one was probably a woman, since they wore their hair short and a masculine-looking uniform. While the Empire of course allowed women to enlist, there still weren't that many, and they were actually more common among the officers. This one wore the chevrons of a sergeant, same as the accused soldier. Looking closely, her knuckles were slightly red. "You were arrested, and were belligerent instead of coming quietly," Tim said dismissively. "For any bumps and bruises you sustained in the process, you only have yourself to blame." Citizens' arrest has a long tradition, and arrest among military personnel is explicitly covered in the regulations, one of the other officers added. She recognized him as a major Tim had taken along who'd been on the southern expedition. Without further ado, the enlisted soldiers who'd been holding the accused started to take him away, and the officers went to disperse the crowd, calling them back to their duties or to their work. Galatea stepped up to Tim, who was faintly frowning into the distance. "I take it this isn't the first time an issue came up?" she asked. "I thought your soldiers were well disciplined." Tim sighed. "We've had to punish several people for looting," he said. "Including 2 female soldiers. It is hardly a problem limited to one demographic. Although I suppose former adventurers might be more prone to it. This was something else, of course. But I'm sure it's not the last time we'll have to judge violent crimes against people. Just make sure these cases are investigated and proper punishments given," Galatea said. "That's all you can do. Plus making sure they don't feel they need to resort to violence for other reasons like getting enough money or food. There's no point expecting everyone in any large group to act morally, especially not soldiers when violence is their trade. But you can shape standards and behavior of the group as a whole." "Yeah," Tim shifted, his blade army sliding against his shell with a low sound. "Those who live by the sword," he trailed off. "Right? Do you ever wonder why people would, well, do all this?" "All the time," Galatea said a bit drilly. "Or at least I used to. I've decided it's just a part of life now. There are a lot of sociological or anthropological theories about violence. Or psychological theories, or others. That doesn't mean violence always has to have the same prevalence or play the same role, or that it's always unjustified. I guess," he said. "You can't imagine committing a violent crime against another hive drone for no reason, or for selfish reasons, because that's not how your society works. And that's admirable, of course. But most other people don't have the psychic link to get to feel others they've hurt, and it's not like the hive kind are exactly pacifist either." "True. I wouldn't really feel bad about hurting other people if Mother wanted me to. I guess I'm being silly," he sighed. "I should be old enough not to ask stupid questions." "There are no stupid questions, Tim," she said, shaking her head. "And you're never too old to think about life." Galatea did wonder a little what had brought this on, and she suspected it was more than these incidents or having to keep the discipline among the troops. It was probably a positive sign if Tim was thinking about the war and what it meant to people. It was one of those things no one really wanted, at least on their side, and she was quite sure the majority of people on the other side wouldn't really want what the war meant either, but it was happening anyway. "Thanks, Galatea." Tim glanced around and shifted, standing up straighter. "I should make sure everything is going well here. The artillery slated for us is arriving today. I need to make sure everything is prepared." "Sure," Galatea agreed, accepting the change of subject, and glanced at the soldiers. "You should probably give that woman a commendation." "At least, I think it was a woman?" She hoped so. It would be embarrassing to get it wrong. "Yes. I might assign her to Lady Marianne. It will be interesting how the locals deal with her." "Do you anticipate trouble?" "Not really. They know they can't risk pissing us off too much. They wouldn't stand a chance in a fight." He shook his head. "The real threat is from Esimon. At least June got home safely." "She did?" Galatea asked. "Yes, she just arrived, along with Edmund and the others. Kiera is happy, at least. Ira says she wanted to give them a big welcome, but had to scale it back because of the war." Galatea hummed. "How do you think the Empire is reacting to being at war again?" Tim hesitated for a moment. "From what I can tell, given what the others say, not many people actually care much. I mean, it doesn't affect most of their lives. They might be concerned about hostilities with Esimon, but that's not exactly new, either. The Empire has been at war on one of its borders before and it didn't really touch people. The government has disseminated the news of what happened and there's some outrage on June's behalf, but they seem happy it's being handled." Galatea nodded. She supposed that made sense. June was popular enough, and most people cared more about their own concerns than international politics. Maybe that would change if the war got worse. Can you go talk to the Dark Elves and see how they're feeling? Tim asked. I've met with their local leaders and there don't seem to be any issues, but it would be nice to get a second opinion. Of course. I've been meaning to do that anyway. How is it going with the tunnels? We've collapsed a few and started putting traps and guard posts in the rest. He shrugged. I'd rather not do more without getting word from their central government. That'll take a bit, she nodded. But I guess that's good enough. I'll see what they say, then. Galatea paused. You're doing well, Tim. He smiled slightly. Thanks. If she didn't miss her guess, he was also glad to be away from the capital and doing something. Something important. Well, if that was true, he certainly wouldn't be lacking for excitement in the coming months. Interlude, Isolation 6. There is more news, Armin, Teddy's Oleron said. Armin paused and looked up. He had finally gotten around to eating something, instead of letting his restlessness drive him to just pace and think. Carefully, he set down his bowl and sat up, giving her his full attention. What news? They weren't alone, but the only other people present were what they would consider close political allies. It was an informal lunch meeting hosted at an estate of House Irezen, and a rather casual affair by the standards of the Eternal Dark's elite. People were sitting around, talking or playing games, some going in or out of the large parlor, and Varys had promised to have a show arranged for later. Probably another tournament of exhibition matches from their best fighters. They had a tradition for that, an almost ritualized thing where he was pretty sure the fights were rigged, assuming it counted as rigged if everyone knew, designed to let them show off their moves and keep a balance between wins and losses. But Armin had more important things to worry about right now. As Oleron sat down on the armchair opposite him, their hostess pointedly moved his bowl back toward his hand and shifted closer beside him. He gave Varys a distracted nod, gaze focusing on the letter Teddy's held. The Empire has definitely won their fight, Teddy's explained, holding out the letter to him. We were expecting that, but this is confirmation. The king who'd been made champion fled the city, along with some Order of the Sun Temple Knights. They used our tunnels to do so. She ignored the sudden sharp looks from Varys and two others close enough to hear the conversation. The local commander sent a strike force into the tunnels, and they guided the Empire's response, but didn't join them to fight. Apparently, the fleeing men escaped. We also have confirmation that Prince Tim of the Starlit Hive is commanding the Imperial forces in Prian. And we have this. She folded out the paper, revealing a second letter. To Armin, from the Imperials. Armin took both letters, quickly reading through them. The first was basically what she'd said. He spent a bit more time with the second. It was co-signed by Mars, something that surprised him a little. Clearly, he'd missed a lot of things while he was down here. Reading the second half of it again, he felt his guts twisting uncomfortably. Madress was going into Esimon alone. I should be with her. She didn't like to take people along for things like this, but he could keep up with her. He was good at hiding his presence and his shadow abilities complemented her psychic ones. They'd worked out how best to use them together years ago. An issue, Armin? Varys asked, briefly setting a hand on his knee. Armin gave her a small smile, but he couldn't help but look at the others. He knew the affair between Varys Irezen and himself was not exactly a secret. It wasn't like it would hurt her reputation, except perhaps to accuse her of having too close ties to outside forces. He was rather sure that even Madress probably knew, or at least, one of the Oleron had probably mentioned it in a letter. He supposed it might not have reached her yet. Armin wasn't really sure what to think of that, and was just as happy to delay that conversation. He still preferred to avoid public displays in general. Varys, on the other hand, seemed to like marking her territory in front of others, if in subtle ways. Not an issue, he said. He glanced around, then lowered his voice. Madress has gone into Esimon. I suppose we will have to wait to hear from her. Teddy's, who had also leaned closer, looked up sharply. She has? Beyond the border regions? Don't worry too much, my friend, Vera said. It's Madress. If she set her mind to it, she can manage it. The Esimon are not going to find her. Armin nodded, agreeing with her. Prince Tim also asks us to investigate and keep a close eye on Clausen, he added. The rulers of Prian must have found out about the tunnels and acquired a map from somewhere. The simplest explanation is Clausen giving them the information. We need to see what else he might have given away. The others exchanged a look. Well, we can certainly try to confirm that, Teddy said, sounding a bit doubtful. We need to discuss what else we can do to keep an eye on him. It's not like we haven't been trying. That was, unfortunately, true, if not understating things. Lucas Clausen had proved to be a persistent thorn in their sides. He clearly had allies and contacts in the Eternal Dark, and Armin wasn't sure they had identified them all. He suspected most of them must be inherited in a way, from other psychics who'd sided with him and honor Sazator, or diplomats or agents from Esimon, most likely. It wasn't quite the same level of access and acceptance he had, but their allies were also a lot more present and active in the Eternal Dark than Madress was. Their change in military procurement was already showing results. Apparently, prices had fluctuated wildly and now it was getting harder to find anyone to sell necessary equipment to the army. To compensate, the soldiers were responsible for acquiring more of their own, which both made their gear more variable and also meant an increased burden as they had to go out and hunt monsters and use their materials to craft armor or weapons. His contacts said there was growing unrest among the troops, even though most probably weren't personally affected by this change yet. That wasn't the only thing, of course. Clausen had managed to torpedo a few other bills and decisions, though none as important as that. He had apparently persuaded some dark elves to basically harass the ambassadors from nearby dwarven states to retire to their homes, although Armin was pretty sure they had at least been considering it before already. His faction seemed to want to increase tension at the eastern borders of the Eternal Dark and possibly to provoke a war there that meant they wouldn't turn their attention west. Unfortunately, a lot of people who were generally in favor of the Eternal Dark becoming more active and involved in the world stage would also want or even only be in it for some expansionism, so Houses Allerin and Irizen's political allies might be pulled away to join that camp. It still left him feeling like another shoe was about to drop. Maybe this was it, now, or at least part of it. Armin cursed that he hadn't thought of the tunnels the Dark Elves had dug over the centuries and how they might impact this brewing conflict. To be fair, he hadn't expected war to break out where it had, though. Why are you all looking like your favorite mount died? Another woman asked, stepping closer. We're here to enjoy ourselves. This new war is regrettable, but I'm sure Armin's people have it well in hand. The news did confirm the Empire has held its own, Teddy said. Insightful as ever, Ferdies. Her tone was faintly sarcastic, but Eperin didn't notice, or, more likely, chose to ignore it. It's not that I don't sympathize, she said. We all wish for this conflict to be resolved quickly. But we all, no offense, Yulaven, should not get too focused on it to the exclusion of other issues. Conflict is brewing in the east, too. My matriarch has already had to call up some of the reserves we'd usually send to the government and increased patrols. And some people have even started vandalizing civic buildings or painting on barracks. Armin folded his arms. As far as he knew, Ferdies Eperin was not closely related to her house's leader, but she was the favored protege of said matriarch's niece and heir. There was a reason she was in this circle and she would know what she was talking about. And House Eperin's main territory was located to the east, at an important trade route but also an important strategic position close to the Dark Elf's eastern neighbors. Are they protesting for more rights or better conditions? Veras asked. Your house's recent edicts should have prevented that. Not everyone is happy with the prospect of dwarves or gnomes getting more power, Eperin curled her lips slightly. I'm sure those protests were from reactionaries who feel their own influence will fall. Too late if you ask me, we've been part of this little show for a while now. Others are calling for war. Surprisingly, some of the more well-integrated dwarf or gnome women too. Armin knew it wasn't exactly about giving them power, more like removing barriers that had already existed. It was a good trend that some houses, Oleron had been one of the first, but not the only one, were no longer holding captives. Armin wouldn't pretend it was just out of idealism. Not that it would be a bad marker for a political faction, though. And how long has it been since the last major war? He mused. The captives taken are probably mostly well integrated and freed by now, if not dead. That makes any remaining ones expensive, right? He tried not to frown. Is that why some of these blockheads want to capture new ones? They just want war with whoever is convenient, he asked. Some do, some have specific grudges or ambitions. Eperon sighed. I can't claim I don't understand it. Our house could make a good profit from it. You'll profit more from increased trade in the long term, Teddy's reminded her. I know, Eperon said, sounding annoyed. I'm here, aren't I? I know this little group isn't in favor of fighting to the east. She looked at Armin again. Although I've heard no firm promises of what we might gain from joining any fighting in the west. Hopefully, it won't be necessary, Armin said calmly. It wasn't the first time he'd been challenged on that, even by supposed political allies. But the Empire can offer a lot. Improved technology for agriculture and production, and if you get friendly enough, for war. Didn't you enjoy the new printing presses, Eperon? The delegation Empress Regina had sent had brought alone some printed books, as well as schematics for a proper printing press. Armin had seen enough of the Dark Elves' woodprint printing to recognize the differences. The houses allied to his hosts had seemed quite taken with it. Most were still working on building their own. It was apparently somewhat tricky, and labor-intensive to get the blocks for the letters right, but they should be patient enough for it. True, it is something, Eperon acknowledged. It all depends on the price. The Empress wants your friendship, she will not demand you join them in war at any cost, Armin said. He tried not to sound annoyed. It wasn't exactly the first time he'd said something like this. Regardless, we need to be careful of public sentiment turning against us, Varys said. From there, the conversation continued, but it didn't feel like they made any progress. Mostly, it was just rehashing points they had already discussed before, and he suspected might discuss again. How much longer is the gathering going to last? He interrupted when there was finally a lull in the conversation. Not much longer, Teddy said. It has been dragging on quite noticeably, hasn't it? That was very true, according to what Armin had heard. Although everyone he asked seemed to have a slightly different opinion as to why. That would be fine, except some of them were contradictory. His best guess was that someone was prolonging it to keep everyone together. After all, a gathering of the councils meant everyone important, or at least their representatives, would be here. It was probably good if you wanted to make important, nationwide decisions. Yes, I wonder what new bill the old maiden is going to bring in next, Varys commented. Maybe we'll be regulating the length of shoelaces? I'd take those over more discussion of sewage treatment, Teddy's answered. Armin sighed. That was embarrassing. Even gnomes know better than to build cesspools with no drainage. Do you have something against gnomes, Armin? Varys asked. Of course not. And that's not my point. Armin paused, glancing at the rest of the room and the water clock against one wall. But I should be going. I will need to update our allies on what we learned. Of course, just be back after lunch, if you would. Armin smiled, inclined his head to Varys and then to the others, and turned to leave. He dodged some kind of spinning toy one of the other women had thrown and watched her brother try to chase it and capture it without cutting his fingers. Then he was through the door and he hurried down the staircase and entrance hall until he found himself on the street. Armin absently patted his pocket to make sure he had the letters and set off. The Empire now had an embassy here. It was provisional and might not last until after the gathering of the councils, but it was something. The mansion was guarded by a small group of swarm drones, who let him pass. He looked at them, then at the street again, considering. He had been alone in this meeting, because he was a citizen of the Eternal Dark and they weren't. In some ways, the arrival of this embassy had integrated him more firmly with Madress family and allies. It didn't take him long to find Ray in the single proper office the small manse sported. He knew the drone had been out on another social outing, but he must have returned recently. And judging by the stack of paperwork, he was hard at work already. Armin knocked and entered, setting the letters down before pulling up another chair. "Good morning, Ray," he greeted. "We got news. You'll want to read this." The other man glanced up, then quickly took the letters and read through them. He was silent, and stayed quiet for a moment after setting them down. "What did they say?" he finally asked. Armin ran through the conversation again, reporting anything interesting. "I'm sorry you're stuck here while the Empire is fighting," he finished, a bit uncertainly. Ray shook his head. He looked unruffled, although Armin was sure that was a skill he'd cultivated. "It's not the first time," he said. "I've accepted that the Hive needs diplomats as well as fighters." "It does," Armin agreed. "And if we can get an alliance with the Eternal Dark, it will help a lot, even if they don't send us any soldiers." "That will not be easy, and internal instability will only make it worse," Ray warned. He shook his head. "I have some news, too. We finally got some soldiers responding positively to our overtures." Armin leaned forward. "Really? Have you learned anything important?" "Maybe, but not because they told us." Ray toyed with one of the pens on the desk. "I think they're organizing, Armin. Removed from their officers, especially the women, maybe including a few veterans. They're starting to find more of a unified voice, or at least a few voices rather than many." Armin paused, chewing on his lip as he thought about that. "Interesting. That could be dangerous for the Dark Elves in charge." "Exactly," Ray agreed drily. "What do you do if the army goes on strike? Not like they can send soldiers in to break it up." Armin winced slightly. "In such a case, wouldn't a government be overthrown?" "Maybe. It takes a little more than just unsatisfied soldiers. I don't think the entire system is about to collapse, but maybe the houses will have a reckoning coming. There have been reform movements, getting disadvantaged people more power," Armin pointed out. "Maybe, but how much of that is actually getting through?" Ray was frowning thoughtfully. "Especially to these soldiers? You were the one who told me how they were basically used as resources with no political voice of their own." Armin shifted uncomfortably in his chair, thinking back to the meeting he'd just left and the people he'd talked to. "Maybe it's good for me to get a reminder. Was I losing sight of the bigger picture?" "It doesn't mean they'll agree with everything," Ray warned. "The average Dark Elf soldier probably doesn't care about dwarves or gnomes' plights in the Eternal Dark. And most will still have loyalty to their houses of birth." Armin nodded slowly. "I need to talk to more men." "Don't we all?" He supposed that was true. Chapter 388, Cults and Surprises. "Regina is going to flip out," Mia said. She sounded downright gleeful. Owen shuffled a little on his feet. "Is that so?" he asked, sounding more tentative. Dan tilted his head and looked more closely at what they had found, not that it was hidden or hard to find. It was slightly disconcerting to see Mia reacting in a way he would expect more from himself or maybe Tia, but he understood. It was kind of funny and he was looking forward to watching the fallout. Through the psychic link. Especially since he was safely away from court. "It's going to be something," Dan agreed. Then he glanced around. But the village elder who had shown them had already left after he sent him away, which was probably for the better. "Is it truly that bad?" Owen asked. "Aren't you a Delver, Sir Owen?" Dan asked. "Why would you approve of this religious nonsense, I guess?" "Of course I am. It seems distasteful. But I suppose I struggle to see the importance. It seems a little overzealous, perhaps, but is there much harm in it?" "They," Dan said slowly, "built a shrine. For our very mortal mother." Now he was the one sounding almost gleeful. "It was a gaudy shrine, too. At least considering the materials they must have access to. There was a lot of copper and bronze, burnished to a shine, with a bit of silver. Most of it used as a thin covering or in plating with symbols and pictures etched into it. There was a bust that looked like a half-decent woodcarver had seen her once from a distance. The main altar of the shrine seemed built into the structure, and the back part of it, whatever it was called, was tall, reaching into the sky. Dried flowers lay on it, and what might have been ashes of burnt things. Technically, it's not a religious shrine, Owen pointed out. He spoke about civic engagement and patriotic feeling and whatnot, didn't he? He also mentioned the Empress spirit, Mia added. It's technically not for Mother as a person. I think. It had been a little hard to make out details. The poor old man had been nervous, clearly sensing they were less than entirely delighted by this revelation. I'm pretty sure that qualifies it as religious, Dan said. This reminds me of something, Mia mused. Didn't they also have a cult for the emperor in the Roman Empire? Mother mentioned it once. They even dedicated it to his spirit instead of him. Right, Dan said, nodding. He knew he had started to smirk, but it was hard to stop. I wonder who will point that little connection out to her first. Owen sighed, clearly a bit annoyed at their conversation. You seem to find it amusing. It's just ironic, Mia shrugged. Regina is, at best agnostic. She's sort of opposed to the local gods if you haven't noticed, and she's not really following any other religion, either. Dan hummed, but nodded. Isn't she observing Lent this year? Religious fasting? Yes, but that's different and you know it, Mia rolled her eyes. She's clearly just doing it to make a point. Not that our enemies will know or care, but I guess that's not the point. It's just the easiest way to thumb her nose at the gods is to appropriate the rites or symbols of an older religion. And their mother was being a bit petty about it. Mia didn't need to say it, they both thought so. Not that Dan would mind. Regardless, he finally said. I don't think we'll accomplish much standing around here. Let's move on. You didn't need to be here, Mia pointed out as they turned to leave. Dan shrugged. You're here, princess mine, and someone has to protect you. Especially since Jay left. The others may all be distracted with the war in the east, but that doesn't mean this area is suddenly not close to a hostile border. And he wouldn't trust the Western Confederation to remain quiet. I have guards, she pointed out, nodding to the couple of Star Guard who were lingering a short distance away. And you all insisted on making me an officer, so now I can do officer stuff, like working on security arrangements. Besides, he was looking for an excuse to spend time with Mia. It was much better than just standing around watching recruits train for the 100th time or watching the border with flying drones doing everything. They fell quiet as they walked. Dan noted their current main guard, a former Nerlian knight, peel off to talk to the village leaders and nodded in thanks. Owen also left to go the other way with a quick goodbye. This little detour had been good, but the village didn't have much strategic importance, so they didn't need to linger. Aside from being close to the border, as the entire region was. Though there were closer settlements. It feels like humans are just prone to superstition, Mia mused as they reached their flying mounts. When institutional religion is retreating, like what happened in Cernlia, it's filled with all sorts of folk beliefs and stuff. It's probably not just humans, he pointed out. Yeah, true. But I get what you mean. I've seen shrines to minor spirits before. They probably don't even exist. I mean, the main gods, sure, they came from another world and all that. But some local forest sprite or a god of granaries? Mia hummed. You know, for all we know they do exist. Like, doesn't worship make gods stronger or something? Or am I confusing that? Who's to say it can't generate spirits into existence too, even if we've just never seen them? Lion seems to do fine without worship, Dan pointed out. He glanced back at the shrine. You don't think Mother will get power from that? Mia laughed. Oh, I'm pretty sure it doesn't work that way. As they settled on their mounts, Dan shuddered slightly at the thought of what an actual organized cult and state religion worshipping their Hive Queen would be like. Yeah, let's not go there. Not that Mother would approve. Maybe they'll institute something else? Like a cult of reason, like during the French Revolution? They spent the rest of the flight bickering playfully about religion, cults, and whether science could ever be a religion itself. Tia said that science was a method and so by definition it wasn't. Dan said some people would treat it as an ideology, and so really, what was the difference, if not semantics? He did notice that neither of them were in any hurry to inform Regina of what they'd seen. They talked to a few other drones and brought it up, but didn't tell her directly. Besides, they were all busy. Max seemed amused and concerned, but Dan had the impression his brother appreciated the distraction since he was just sitting and worrying in the capital, trying to protect everyone without being able to personally go and do stuff. Originally, he should have been focused on plans to move the court to the new capital. Dan supposed that move was delayed now. Although he doubted their mother would leave it be for long. Personally, Dan was already noticing how his own area of operations got less interest. The focus had shifted east and the border fortifications here were judged good enough. It probably wasn't wrong, but he wondered if or when he'd be reassigned elsewhere. Until then, he would do his best here. And Mia was also still off and around, she even spent less time further east now. Though she had been touring their major factories. How are the soldiers taking it? She asked over the psychic link after a short pause. Dan shrugged. As well as expected. They're antsy. We all are. Many of them still have some stupid ideas about winning glory in war. I suppose we need that for recruitment, but God, some of these kids. At least the veterans are doing better. He was pretty sure that a few of the recruits had managed to dodge the age restriction. It had been a hard-fought compromise anyway. Regina had wanted to set it to 18 years, most others had argued for 16, if there had to be a limit anyway. In the end, there was now a minimum age of 17 to enlist. They weren't supposed to see full combat until they were 18, but Dan doubted how well that would hold up in practice. It didn't take long for them to reach the nearest military base. They had been designed in several layers, with key points housing larger bases and smaller outposts in between. This was one of the bigger ones and also served as a command and intelligence center. As Dan and Mia touched down and dismounted, several soldiers stood ready to take their mounts, and he could see others caring for other flying drones already. Dan had barely turned around before he met another vaguely familiar officer, who went up to them and directed them to Galatea, who had shown up recently and was waiting in the command center. Dan sighed and increased his pace. I'm always glad to see you, but I thought you would be in the east, focusing on that project or preparations against Esimon? Mia asked as they sat down together in an unused conference room. Galatea drifted over to a chair and an aide brought the two of them tea before leaving again. Galatea shrugged slightly. She looked surprisingly relaxed. I was, but I decided to check on you, as well. Just because the Esimon might be eyeing an invasion doesn't mean the Western Confederation is just going to sit around on their backsides. That was surprisingly similar to what he'd been thinking, Dan supposed. Mia hummed, leaning forward slightly. How are Tia and the others? The dig? She asked. I've talked to them over the psychic link, but you were actually there. They're fine, Galatea reassured her. She cocked her head slightly. The dig has given us more information on the hive kind than I expected, even if most of it won't be relevant in a technological or military sense. Tia is very interested. So are the rest. I think Regina is thinking about larger policy or something regarding that past genocide, but she's been tight-lipped about it. Dan nodded seriously. The mention seemed to turn the conversation more somber, as it often did. But he shook off the mood after a moment and leaned forward. So, have you seen that little shrine some villagers put up to Regina? Weird, right? I've actually seen that one before, Galatea said, sounding a bit amused. Only via scrying. I admit I looked around a bit for things like that. You're lucky you got a reasonably artistic one. So there are more of them? He asked curiously. Of course. At least depending on your definition. Some are little more than a portrait hung up with some incense or flowers. Others could be confused with a stalker shrine. Galatea smiled slightly. I don't think we've seen the last of that trend. That figures, Mia nodded. Well, as long as it doesn't get any worse. That depends on your definition of worse, Galatea replied. There is another trend some people might find more concerning. Interestingly, there's even a chapel in a village not too far from here, quite close to the border. A chapel? Dan repeated. Or a shrine. Whatever you like to call it. Mia propped her head on a hand. Would you show us, Galatea? She asked sweetly. The maniform seemed to consider for a moment, before she visibly decided to humor her. She stood up and Dan and Mia scrambled up as well. I suppose I can practice my scrying, Galatea said. Look closely, we'll see. She trailed off. Dan frowned and cocked his head. The air shimmered in front of her and it felt almost like there should be a system notification screen presented, although there clearly wasn't one. A gray haze filled the area instead. Is that smoke? He asked. No, that looks like a scrying exclusion zone, right? Mia sked. Galatea, I thought you would have remembered there was one there. There isn't, Galatea replied, sounding distant. She'd gone still. Dan straightened up and exchanged a look with Mia. He could sense her sudden alarm, mirroring his. What's going on there? She demanded. Galatea didn't answer, she didn't even seem to have heard her, clearly focused on this scrying blockade. Dan turned and quickly walked to the door. He needed to find out what was going on, and they should have eyes on this area. He was already reaching out with the psychic link, trying to find which drone was responsible for that. He'd barely opened the door before he almost ran into someone else hurrying the other direction. The man slid to a stop, gaze flickering around. Sir? Princess? Jeff? Dan leaned a hand on the doorframe. What's going on? Concerning reports from the border area, sir, Jeff reported. A plume of smoke has been seen rising from the location of one village. Apparently, flying drones report seeing more smoke. The handlers are sending them closer to look. I thought you should know. Good, Dan said absently. Jeff had been with him in the south, he was a good man and one of the few outside the hive he trusted. It looked like someone had decided not to loop Dan in yet, but he had decided Dan needed to know. It also appears to be a dead zone to scrying right now, when it shouldn't be blocked. Something is very clearly wrong. A raid, do you think? Mia asked, appearing in the doorway behind him. Dan glanced at Jeff, who looked unsure, and shrugged. Don't see what else it would be, but we should have noticed a raiding force crossing the border. They could have just snuck in another way, Mia suggested. From a different border, or just gone into the Great Forest, then come out in the Empire pretending to be adventurers and heading north. It's not like we've sealed it off. If this is a planned operation. Dan nodded, that made sense. He was more focused on the psychic link, though, on the flying drones close to that area. Finding where the reports of smoke came from wasn't that hard. Just as Dan was focusing on it, one flying drone was shot down, sudden pain, then plummeting, and nothing. He flinched slightly and focused on the other drones, trying not to go too deeply behind their eyes. They spread out at his nudge and he focused on their vision. The village looked like something in a war zone. It had been surrounded by a palisade, but chunks of it had been blown out. People were moving around chaotically. Flashes of light reflecting off metal with some of them showed weapons and armor. Some of the houses inside were on fire with no clear pattern. One building towards the middle was particularly badly off, although on a second look, it was mostly built of stone, so it was the roof and supports burning. On its side was a large wooden cross, so that was what Galatea had meant, he supposed it made sense. It was also burning, but was still recognizable, and the fire clearly hadn't had much time yet, so it was recent, that also made sense, they'd just been warned. We must hurry, Dan said, quickly pulling back to talk to those around him and also sending a mental order to the drones in the stables. Jeff, raise the men, I've called an emergency. Mia grabbed his shoulder. Be careful, Dan. If this is a trap. She didn't tell him not to go, though. I doubt it, it looks more like some kind of symbolic or ideological strike, he replied. But we'll call reinforcements. Then he turned and hurried off, breaking into a run in a few steps. The people at the stables were already scrambling to let all the flying drones line up, their riders moving into position. The horses and tamed monsters, less of those than he'd like, were also being readied. Dan tried to focus on getting ready as quickly as possible and not dwell on the implications. They could still rescue some of the villagers if they hurried, he was sure. Mother would want that. He felt the attention of others on him over the psychic link as Mia had clearly passed the word. A young soldier ran up to him with his sword and a gun, and Dan grabbed it without pause. He was still buckling the belt as he swung himself in the saddle of a flying drone mount and called them into the air. Chapter 389, Raid and Recognition. Ada paced up and down the outpost's tiny yard. It was barely large enough to serve as a landing pad for a few swarm drones, if they got cozy with each other, or for mustering more than a single squad. Right now, several people were assembling outside, on the other side of the gate in the palisade. The outpost had never been intended as more than a small stopover point or place to store rations for a few days. Unfortunately, she had been traveling to inspect the border fortifications, and let herself be seen by the soldiers there, yet again when news of this attack came, which meant she was now between the village they'd targeted and the border itself. That didn't particularly concern her, but it was annoying that she wasn't able to talk directly with most of her human subordinates and had to ask other drones to relay messages, when they might have other things to do, too. She was also quite focused on the psychic link, not just to coordinate with others, but to find out what was happening. Dan had taken off as soon as he'd been informed, predictably enough. After the last incident at the border, Max had given Ada a talk and she'd apologized and promised not to do it again. She was a general now and had to direct others instead of charging in personally. He might have a bit of an overprotective streak, but he wasn't wrong about that. Well, this time it really wasn't her fault that she wasn't in a bigger base further south. If he had tried to give the same talk to Dan, she didn't think anyone really expected it to work. Dan was Dan and 1,000 scoldings wouldn't change that. He was the type to charge straight into any fight when he had the chance. In this case, Ada didn't begrudge him that. Her shell itched at the thought of the raiders on their territory and what they might be doing. But she'd have time to kick herself over missing it later. Right now they needed to act. Dan had taken several flying drones and packed all of the soldiers he could onto them. There was also a mounted force moving on the ground, though they would naturally arrive later. Flying drones from bases and outposts further away were already moving towards the target as well, and when Ada focused on it, she could dimly sense Dan directing them. The few Star Guard who had been present in that base had stayed and were starting to move Mia south, along with a few other soldiers they had basically commandeered. Ada didn't mind that. If this thing was some kind of trap meant to bait their forces away from the base so their enemies could attack it and capture an imperial princess, they needed to be prepared. It seemed in character, the sort of thing their enemies might do. They did seem to have some kind of grudge against imperial royalty. Maybe they'd finally figured out they couldn't take out Regina that easily and moved on to her closest supporters and family? Regardless, she needed to ensure Mia's safety as well. She turned her attention further north again, to the village. The smoke had increased, to the point it was hard to make out details. It was obvious the village was still on fire. So far, they still only had a few flying drones, circling in the sky over the village by now, at a safe distance. But at least it was something and they weren't completely blind. Ada watched the fighters. It was getting easier to make out who were villagers trying to flee or barricade themselves in, and who were the attackers. They wore mismatched armor and wielded a variety of weapons, and the magic and skills they used showed these weren't random hunters with a grudge. Well, damn it, Ada muttered as she recognized one of the faces. She nudged the drone whose senses she was using to turn and got a better look at others, seeing several other people she vaguely recognized, if she was right. Ada? Someone asked hesitantly. She shook her head, looking at Hunter, one of the few other drones here. They'd only recently gained sapience and still had the slight build of a flying drone. They were quick, though. She didn't often mentor someone, but those she did were worth it. It's the Brotherhood of Violets, she explained. I recognize one or two faces from the previous incident. It looks like they managed to sneak across the border after we refused to let them through. Maybe they were still trying to provoke an incident, only now they've escalated. Ada reached out to the psychic link and conveyed her impression. It looked like she wasn't the only one to notice, at least. Mia was clearly more focused on the link than on safely getting away, though it was currently up to her guards to rally the escort they were gathering. She gave her a mental hug as reassurance, before Ada nudged Mia pointedly in the direction of the closest city. Then she glanced around again. "Let's go." "Is that wise?" Hunter muttered, but called several of the drone mounts they traveled with to them. "I won't get too close," Ada told them. "But I'd prefer to be in the air rather than playing a sitting duck here. We're gathering flying drones from nearby anyway. Maybe you should go with them." Without further ado, she swung herself on the closest of the flying drone mounts and watched as the few humans in her current party did the same. The new aide looked a bit green, but she insisted that everyone got to try it at least once and was taught the basics, so they managed. Almost absent-mindedly, Ada guided their drones as they ascended, surrounded by a cloud of other flying drones led by Hunter. The flocks from other bases were converging now. Not all of their complements had been sent, of course, they couldn't afford that, but enough to make for a good strike force put together. There were also mounted soldiers, or those who were particularly fast because of their class, from the closer bases, while other troops were more slowly assembled as backup and to secure the area. Ada checked on them, as well, while Hunter guided their own group's flight. The issue was that they couldn't be sure of the enemy's strength. It was hard to get an exact count and some men could be hidden inside the yet unburnt buildings, but they also couldn't assume they were the only hostiles. Regardless, it seemed like a sufficient number of drones were being assembled for their rapid response strike team. Ada was kept busy coordinating with their leaders. She also checked in with Dan, who was closest, unsurprisingly. "Don't go in alone, at least wait for the closest reinforcements to come," she told him. She could sense his annoyance, his reluctance, but finally, he sighed and she could feel his decision. "All right. It's your call. But I'll go in as soon as possible, when the next group arrives. Speed is of the essence here." "I didn't say you couldn't prepare," she replied. It didn't surprise her that he pushed the envelope on getting as close as possible, barely stopping before he would enter actual combat with the raiders. His presence certainly got a response. Ada watched closely as the fighters in the village converged and set up their own defensive position. Some of them were clearly mages, and they took material from the burning or burned houses, as well, to make simple barricades and overhangs. Maybe if they didn't damage the houses so much, they would have had an easier time with that, she mused. The obvious best choice for a defensive position was the little church, and wasn't that another kettle of worms? The villagers seemed to have fought hardest here, barricading themselves inside, maybe because it was the most defensible structure. It took Ada a moment to realize the invaders' control of it was still shaky at best. Someone kept taking potshots at them, and too many of their men were still spread out. It looked like some of them were even shouting at each other. Then the airborne forces of two nearby bases arrived close together. They numbered less than Dan's unit even together, but it was enough to give the Imperial forces the upper hand. As expected, he barely gave them time to assume a coherent formation before he called the attack. At this point, Ada had to look at her own surroundings. "I'll hang back here with the 2nd and 3rd squad and act as a rallying point for those further away," she told Hunter. "Take the rest of the troops and lead the reinforcements from this quarter. Remember, we need to cut off their retreat. If I give the sign, rest on the Tell outpost and form up there to block their way." "I understand," Hunter replied, sounding too much like a kid to her, even if she knew that wasn't truly the case. The fight had started now, and it seemed to be going well. She observed closely, switching between the viewpoints of several drones, but staying quiet to not distract them. The Violets fighters were, Ada had to admit, competent. She wondered if they'd done this sort of thing before for a moment, before focusing on the fight. Luckily, they couldn't do much against enemies from the air. Dan only had his drones use bombs and grenades sporadically, in a very targeted way. There would be too much collateral damage otherwise. Arrows, bullets, and other things still rained down on the raiders. It provided covering fire for a second wing of the flying drones to descend more closely. The fight was brutal, but it wouldn't be over quickly. Ada checked in on the other troops the Empire had in the area and stepped in to coordinate them where necessary. She told her own escort to hold, letting her mount circle slowly in the air as they drifted towards the top of the nearby hills. There was no town here, but a crossroads between two decently sized roads, so it was as good a place to remain as any. Before her drones had to set down, this would be finished. In the meantime, the other squads she had directed here arrived, mostly smaller flocks in loose order, but they were only building a reserve. She also checked on Mia, who was currently on her way south with her guardians. Good. Watching gave Ada too much time to worry about the goals of this attack and where it fit into a larger strategy, and she didn't like what she could come up with. This was probably some kind of provocation and psychological strike. It wasn't like they got a military target. A raid like this seemed like a suicide mission, but she supposed if anyone would be up for something like that, it would be fanatics. For now, there was nothing to do but deal with it. Only a few minutes had actually passed since the alarm had first been sounded, though it felt longer. The ground troops were moving, but it would take them a while longer to arrive. Dan had done well so far. By the time Hunter's reinforcements were in position, and a few others from deeper inside the Empire were approaching, he had managed to force most of the enemy out of their shelters and blocked them from trying to scatter, instead penning them up around the town square. The fire helped, making much of the village extremely dangerous to go through or fight in, but it had also taken to strategically dropping a few bombs. Ada really hoped there had been no civilians hiding in those houses. Most likely they were already dead, she thought. And Dan has mages that would have sensed life. She wasn't going to ask and distract them now, though. The fight didn't exactly make the village safer, and several more buildings were collapsing. Some of them sent sparks or bits of wood flying. Ada watched one fighter be struck by a roof tile in the back of the head, bypassing the shield covering his front. This was a death trap, they would have to get out of it. Unfortunately, the Brotherhood raiders seemed to have realized that as well. They gathered together, but a few of them started advancing to the east, where there seemed to be a relatively clear path, covering each other with shields and moving from cover to cover. Ada frowned as she watched. Their discipline is still high. Dan shifted his troops in response, bringing another wing in closer on the eastern side. Arrows and spells rained down on them, and a few winged drones were hit, dropping to the ground. Then the rest of the raiders turned smoothly and started running for the northwest. Ada tightened her grip on her mount, biting her lip as she watched one of the mages cast a massive ice spell that completely froze a section of the smoldering houses, making a path straight through them. A man with a large magical shield barreled through, clearing the path, and the rest followed. Of course, Dan wasn't idle. After the initial surprise, giving them a few precious seconds, he wheeled around and started harrying the humans. Hunter moved his group in as well, advancing from outside the village to meet them. Ada was tempted to move her own gathered forces as well, but refrained. Her brother had this well in hand, and she was needed as a strategic reserve and to watch for other enemies. Quickly, she checked on her flying drones deployed further out, making sure she hadn't missed anything. Luckily, it seemed Dan was still whittling down the enemy's numbers fast enough even as they tried to break out of the village. Several of the raiders made it, their speed increased with magic or class skills and leaving their comrades behind. Ada frowned, considering their speed, but Hunter's drones dove after the fleeing raiders. They quickly learned how futile it was to try to run from flying drones without convenient buildings to hide behind. They wouldn't make it back to the border even if they tried. On this relatively open ground, they wouldn't even make it to her own location. Several more flying drones fell. The sapient ones and those with riders tended to be higher up, letting the swarm drones bear the brunt of the damage. Although, trying to take stock, she quickly found several riders were also injured. They'd need fast medical attention. Ada made sure the reinforcements coming had good healers, but her subordinates had seen to that. She wished they had a psychic, but unfortunately, Regina's students were elsewhere. Sighing, Ada turned back to the other troops under her command and split off several units. She tried for one from each deployment. Then the flying drones were set to scour the countryside and the area in front of the border. There was no point taking chances. To be extra sure, she also sent additional scouts to watch the border itself and the area beyond. If the Westerns had posted watchers, they should find them. This had all the makings of a trap, but she supposed it was probably more of a political one. Ada was distracted from her tasks by feeling a faint stir going through the psychic link. She'd tried to keep one metaphorical ear out, to keep on top of what was happening, and the stirring caught her attention. Looking more closely, there was a small shift, like if a new drone joined the hive, except it was different. Ada focused more closely. She recognized the mind, even if she wasn't a psychic and hadn't sensed him before. But the man was familiar. She concentrated on him, sensing him reaching out broadly to the senior hive drones. "Hello everyone," Edmund said. His mental voice was quiet, hiding uncertainty, and she sensed the equal parts apprehension and excitement in it. "It is an honor to meet like this. I hope to speak to you all in time. I know this is a great show of trust, and I will prove myself worthy of it. I hope you will be patient with my mistakes as I learn." Well, that answered why Mother hadn't been focused on watching this fight. She must have been busy talking with him, and overseeing the progress of her infect skill. Ada smiled slightly, adding her own wordless congratulations and welcome to the torrent of responses Edmund received. It looked like her queen had overcome her hesitance to use that skill to join more people to the hive. Well, personally, she didn't disapprove. Chapter 390, Acts of War. Yesterday, Griff's Rest had been a decently sized, prosperous village. Not large enough to be called a town, but large enough for a variety of specialized trades. There had been a famine a few years ago, but the years since then had been good to it. The village had grown again. It had also had a small temple, but one that had fallen into disrepair a while ago. The area wasn't very religious, despite the proximity to the Western nations and even Esimon, and the founding of the empire had only intensified this. But the temple had still stood, until the village had decided to repurpose it. A group of former adventurers had settled here, and brought not just money, but interest in a new faith. Or rather a very old one. They'd been convinced by a few other men who'd fancied themselves preachers, having spent some time in the capital. At their head had been a former official from Sarah's court, even if he'd only had a minor post in the new Ministry of the Interior dealing with census records, who had tried to find and collect every scrap of information he could on religion before the cataclysm. It had turned out to be their undoing, Max mused as he watched Dan pick his way over a charred wood beam. At least he couldn't think of a different reason the village had been chosen as a target. There was little street left in this spot, and he was glad he wasn't there personally. The impression of smoke, charred bodies, and filth from the other drone's senses was bad enough. Dan seemed focused, but he knew that he had paid careful attention to the impromptu briefing. "And the village simply adopted this faith?" he asked quietly. The man who was mostly limping at Dan's side hesitated. He was the only one of the adventurer group who had survived. He didn't seem to have processed all of his fellows' deaths yet. Instead, he seemed a bit dazed. He hadn't suffered a head wound, though, just a broken arm and scratches on his torso and legs. "I think some folks liked the idea of a god who didn't demand sacrifices," he said distantly. "He'd already done all of that, right?" Max grimaced, wondering what kind of scripture or whatever else they had mangled for that bit. "There's always atheism," Dan said drily, but his tone was still gentle enough. The ex-adventurer shook his head. "No. If a creator is out there, why should we not acknowledge him?" Dan hummed. "Well, I'm not here to debate religion," he said. "But you said this chapel was first built weeks ago?" The man nodded. "About 2 months or so, I reckon." Dan sighed. Max could tell they were thinking the same thing. That was enough time for word to spread, and for the Brotherhood of Violets to pick this place as a target. Although that implied that they might have already planned something and simply chosen this as a good example to make, rather than genuinely coming up with this idiocy just because some village converted to another religion. He left Dan to the awkward conversation and instead focused more on the village itself. There were enough drones around that getting several viewpoints was trivial. He supposed some of the buildings might be saved, though Mia would know better. The temple especially. Maybe they would turn it back to its original purpose? Assuming the village was rebuilt and resettled. Some of its inhabitants had survived, of course. They had managed to hide in underground hidey holes the raiders hadn't found, and managed not to die of smoke inhalation, or they had run, made it out of the village and scattered in the countryside. The drones Ada had put to the task were still collecting the last of these people, escorting them to the outpost that had quickly been raised outside the village. Far enough away they would hopefully be spared some reminders, but allowed to visit under supervision if they wanted. The bodies had almost been cleared by now, too. The raiders had not been stupid enough to bring any identifying documents, but Max had confirmed with several people that a few of them had been identified as part of the Brotherhood of Violets. More of them would hopefully be identified soon. They also carried some coins minted in the Western Confederation, although that was still not uncommon in the border region, so it was not a smoking gun. He briefly turned his attention away from the village, and back to his surroundings. The command center of the Star Guard was quiet around him, despite several of his siblings also being there. Most were clearly immersed deeply in the psychic link on their own. He gave them a wan smile before turning away. His mother's presence in the psychic link currently loomed large. She was angry, a quiet fury he had felt before, but which was still subtly different each time. If he asked her, he knew Regina would admit a part of it was her Hive Queen side, angry at any intrusion into her territory. He didn't think there was much of a distinction these days, though. They were hardly two separate entities or anything. Edmund was still with her. He seemed slightly anxious, which was probably understandable considering his entry into their hive had been marked by such a disaster. Janice was with them, reassuring him, from the feeling of her mind in the link. Max glanced around, making sure they were all on task, and checked on all the major assignments of the Star Guard again, before he made his way out of the door and went to join them. This small security command center was located close to the royal apartments and private conference rooms, so he only had to walk a few meters. Edmund almost flinched when he entered the room, and his slightly wide-eyed gaze told Max he was getting used to the sensation in the psychic link, to sensing their presence and knowing when someone approached. Max supposed it was more keen and detailed than whatever he had got just from his psychic senses before. "So, we're all safe?" Janice asked drily. She was sprawled on a sofa and patted the cushion next to her invitingly. Max walked closer, sitting down in an armchair beside it and looking at Edmund, who was still perched in another chair. "As safe as can be," he reported. Not that she had really asked for a report, but he figured he might as well. He suspected she was actually a bit concerned. Mia has reached her target without incident and there are enough soldiers deployed there, on alert now, that I doubt anything would get through. Tia is still in the excavation site with Galatea and the others. Tim is in Prian, but the Esimon have not advanced yet. There's no one else who should be in danger. He noted that June wasn't here. She'd been spending a lot of time with her remaining family or withdrawn in her own rooms lately. That wasn't surprising, and if it wasn't just Kiara or Florence trying to wrap her in wool, he hoped she would come to terms with what happened in peace. "Good," Regina said. She sounded half-absent, and was probably still looking in the psychic link. Max glanced at Edmund again, hesitating for a moment before he said what was on his mind. "If you are up to it, Edmund, maybe you could go on your first mission for the Hive? A psychic would probably be useful out there. There are no survivors from the raiders, so we can't interrogate them, but it could at least be good to check if there might not be ones who hid and escaped." Regina frowned, her eyes focusing squarely on them. "I have checked. Even if it's not close, I would have noticed anyone who did not have some kind of help in hiding from psychic senses." Max nodded. If she disagreed with his suggestion, then that was that. "That said, it might not be a bad idea," Regina continued, turning to Edmund. "What do you think? Of course, you've done tasks for me before, so this would hardly be your first mission, but having the psychic link now should help." Edmund inclined his head. "If that is your wish, my empress, of course I'll go." He paused briefly. "Or my queen?" "Either would work," she told him. "And you can call me Regina when it's just us." "That's what I tell the drones too, they just don't always do it." He nodded, his brows furrowed. "Of course, thank you." "And no, it doesn't mean you're adopted," Regina added, probably guessing or sensing where his mind went. "I'm sure we'll clarify that to the public. Of course the other members of the Hive are my children, but well, the situation is different with humans, or anyone else, joining it." Max knew Regina and Janice still considered themselves sisters, even if Janice was legally her daughter. They were almost deliberately stubborn about that. She'd certainly been part of the Hive for a while before that adoption. I understand, Edmund hastily assured her. It would be quite politically unwise to let me or any later additions to the Hive claim anything like that. More like a political nightmare, Max mused. Currently, people did not seem too interested in trying to petition for the honor of joining the Hive, if they even knew it was a possibility. Probably because the cost of it being their mind's inviolability, or at least privacy, seemed too high. But if they gained royal status along with it, a lot of people would suddenly care less about that. And that didn't even consider the succession or chains of command. Good, Janice said. To get back on topic, Max, you haven't seen any signs of another attack or a second prong to a trap? He shook his head. No, this seems to be what it appears to be. There have been watchers, though. More tamed beasts in the western skies and above the border. They could have been posted because they knew what would happen, or just in response to the activity, though we can't know for sure. If no one in the Western Confederation knew what would happen, I'll eat my hat, Regina muttered. Well, at least she actually could, unlike most people who said that. But Max didn't point that out. Probably, he agreed instead. These attackers clearly didn't act on their own, but exactly who knew what isn't obvious either. He could tell they were thinking the same thing again. Those who had done this might genuinely have just wanted to purge the heretics, or something. They were zealots. Who knew what they were capable of? But the Brotherhood's leadership had to be more than just zealots. They'd had some success with recruiting and probably politics among the orders, so they couldn't just be idiots. This was not just random violence. We need to decide what to do now, Janice said. She paused, then turned to Edmund. Do you want to leave? Max could sense the man was a bit taken aback at her bluntness, but he agreed. I'd like to get ready to travel to the village. Regina nodded permission. Let us know if there are any issues. I'll keep an eye out, as well. They waited until he had left. Max raised an eyebrow slightly at Janice, who only shrugged. They didn't need to say anything more. He didn't distrust Edmund, but he also couldn't be sure how good he was at keeping secrets, and he probably shouldn't be told about the Empire's highest-level plans right away, either. It would be a bit much pressure for his first day. We need to secure all evidence first, I suppose, Regina said. We have witnesses who can place some of the dead raiders with the Brotherhood group who tried to gain entry in that prior incident. That makes their affiliation very clear. They even gave us identification papers back then, so we also know they were from the Western Confederation. At least most of them. We'd have to check the details. We'll need statements from Ada, Dan, and the others. Probably Mia, since she was watching over the psychic link, and her being a princess will lend it some additional weight. I'll make arrangements to collect testimony from the non-Hive soldiers who were there, too, Max said. He would need to have those soldiers deployed to the site to view the bodies and confirm their recognition. It should be easily doable. If this incident meant what he suspected it meant, it would be best if they had the most extensive documentation they could gather. Good, Janice said. So we will have proof that we were attacked by the Brotherhood of Violets. She paused briefly. Many people would say it is an act of war and thus cause to declare war. Isn't it? Regina hummed. I'm sure that's what some people were planning for, she muttered. Her tone was even, almost light, but he could still sense the anger she felt underneath it. Does that mean the Empire won't declare war? Max asked. Regina stood up and started pacing up and down for a few meters. We will send demands to the Western Confederation, she finally said. These people are guilty of many serious crimes, and the Brotherhood of Violets as a whole, or rather their leadership, is very likely complicit. Thus, they must be extradited to us to face trial and to let justice be done. Janice leaned deeper into her couch, tapping her fingers on the armrest. Max considered the deployment of their troops, and where he could assign more Star Guard. Which of his siblings would need extra protection? And if they don't? No one needed to spell out that it was likely this demand would be refused. If it's not and they concede, all the better, I guess, he thought. It will at least be a victory for the Empire. But they had been trying to push the Empire into declaring war for a while now. He didn't think the circumstances were really unfavorable enough for them to stop now. Then I'll give them what they want and make them choke on it, Regina said quietly. Her tone was cold, but he could feel the burning heat in her mind, anger hardening into determination. Max smiled, and didn't bother to hide his own feelings, echoing hers, shifting until they were in sync. It was an almost giddy feeling, except still too grounded for that. Janice smiled, showing teeth. He wondered for a moment if the incisors were a little longer than normal for humans, and how had he not noticed it before. We will be with you every step of the way, Regina, she promised. Max didn't say the same thing, because he didn't need to. He let the sensation of his mind and the psychic link speak for him. He knew all the other drones would feel the same. It will be war, then, Regina continued softly. War may be brutal, bloody, and vicious, but some things are worth it, Max said, sensing that was what she needed to hear right now. We will make the world better for the generations after us. Better lives, without being held in stasis, without having to follow these gods. Yes. Regina smiled slightly, her eyes glinting. And who else is going to give the gods the reckoning they so richly deserve?